It should formulate a desired end state and the strategic objectives, which may lead to that end. Strategic guidance documents should focus on the what, not necessarily on the how. That's why strategic guidance documents will often be followed up by an implementation plan to clarify in which way the agreed strategic objectives can be met based on priorities, timelines, required resources, and which responsibilities should be allocated to meet those aims. Strategic objectives should be formulated in accordance with parameters of a successful formulation and action. They should be specific, measurable, attainable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. This approach will make it easier to evaluate if and to which extent the objectives had been met. The current nature of threats and challenges presses to introduce new understandings regarding the protection and resilience of states and people, where defense is an essential part of a complex constellation of resources, from technology to energy security, from security of supply to health and social stability, to defense economy, industrial and technological development, or innovation. In the current strategic context, cooperation is not an option, but a necessity that will structure collaborative practices in different ways, whether by pooling and sharing defense resources or by more willing and capable, and strive for a more integrated approach with the help of permanent structure cooperation projects of the European Defence Fund and the European Peace Facility, or with the support of NATO's Committee of National Armaments and NATO's Innovation Fund, or by simply better embedding and integrating defense planning between the European Union Coordinated Annual Review Defense and NATO defense planning. The growing competition among powers, the progress of war in Ukraine, and the approval and implementation of the EU Strategic Compass and the new NATO strategic concept suggest the importance of introducing adjustments in European countries' defense stand with impact on countries' defense posture and centrality. Today, we will dedicate the second day of the seminar to compare different experiences of European countries, Germany, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, with respect to the process of development and the review of their own national defense guidelines. We have asked our speakers to share with us the strategic context in which these documents are being revised, their substance, the process, and the stakeholders which are involved in this process. Different strategic documents have distinctive outlines and distinctive purposes. National defense concepts, white papers, strategic defense reviews, and international security strategies translate different levels of ambition and implementation tempos for defense policies. On the one hand, defense white papers translate a more short-term governmental project oriented by electoral cycles and by government's political perspectives on defense affairs. On the other hand, strategic defense reviews pertain to a medium-term document which often translates a process of re-evaluation of policies and practices, an assessment of the state of play in defense affairs in both the political and operational dimensions, translating sometimes a paradigm shift in the way defense affairs are conducted and security and defense culture is changing. National defense concepts should offer a structural state view with a whole of government approach to defense, and thus reflect a more integrated approach between defense administrations and stakeholders, military, civilians, actors from the industrial and technological sectors, as well as private and public actors. National defense concepts comprehend threats assessment. They identify and prioritize strategic objectives, define a timeline for implementation, and include allocation of required resources on the base of courses of action. The current geopolitical rivalry and the invasion of Ukraine has been having many unintended consequences, claiming from the elaboration of a new or review of defense guidelines. This occurs against an international background that redefined the centrality of defense as a public policy and as an existential domain for the sovereign independence of states and societies. The conflict in Ukraine has united some of the strongest and more prosperous strategic actors in the world, from Europe to the United States to Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. It strongly and successfully reconnected the post-Brexit United Kingdom in the European context with a strong military and solidary response to the war effort in Ukraine with its European allies, with NATO, and with the European Union. Germany decided to pledge to spend more than 100 billion euros on defense and pledged to increase its defense contributions to the 2% threshold. It provided the incentive to what can be perceived as a paradigm shift in the case of the Netherlands defense strategy, with a greater focus on European defense initiatives and collaborative projects. Denmark, despite recognizing NATO's centrality and a really leading role as a central strategic player, it acknowledges Europe's significance in global security, its relevance as a desecretization agency within a single political community, with a key role in hybrid warfare and cyber diplomacy. Spain, with its national security strategy, supports the choice for a combination of deterrence and dialogue with NATO and the balanced participation in missions and operations in the European Union, in NATO, and the United Nations. At the political and strategical level, all these documents tell us something about how threats are perceived, which strategic goals must be pursued nationally, and which should or must be achieved collectively. They tell us which and why priorities are set, how alliance systems and preferred strategic partners are prioritized, and how these choices impact on the defense institutional architecture and defense cooperation with allies and partners. By thinking more commonly and in a more integrated manner, we can act more collectively in the defense of the values and the ways of life generations before ours fought for, guaranteeing that democracy and multilateralism prevailed. With this, I will conclude, thanking the presence of the Ministry of Defense, which proves the importance attached to the themes which bring us together today. I would also like to express my appreciation to all speakers and all the moderators in presence and through video conference, and also to thank them even further, because this is a time of change, and it's a time of change which in itself is demanding for yourselves and for the services and the institutions you represent. I wish you all excellent presentations and a very, very fruitful debate. Thank you.
Her Excellency, the Portuguese Minister of National Defense, Professor Helena Carreiras, will now address the audience.
Dear Director of the National Defense Institute, Madam Council of State, Secretary General of the Portuguese Republic Information System, Vice Admiral, Head of the Military House of His Excellency the President of the Portuguese Republic, ambassadors, representatives of the armed forces and of the Ministry of National Defense, speakers and moderators, distinguished civilian and military authorities, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great satisfaction to open today the 4th edition of the National Defense Seminar. This yearly event serves the purpose of fostering the debate within the Portuguese defense community while helping to establish new bridges with society. Since it was first created in 2019, it has brought together the main actors in national defense policy with the aim of providing space for internal reflection. Since then, We have widened our approach to include both a restricted work session that took place yesterday and an open debate with the participation of the general public. Our reasoning is clear. Without steady linkages to knowledge production and public debate, it is not possible to make sound political decisions. It is vital that we keep promoting a productive dialogue between decision makers, researchers, and practitioners to better develop national strategic thinking and better contribute to ongoing international debates. This seminar is a direct and important contribution to such a goal. To all the speakers and moderators, thank you for your presence and for the important contributions that I'm sure you will provide us throughout the day. I thank the National Defense Institute, as well as for helping to organize this event in close collaboration with my cabinet and the Secretary General of the Ministry of National Defense. As usual, the proceedings of the seminar will be published under one of the IDN's publication series, thus ensuring that the rich content of our discussions will endure beyond the event itself. I would also like to thank the participants here at IDN and all those following us through live streaming this morning. This is an important way to expand the public impact of the National Defense Seminar and contribute to bringing the Portuguese society closer to national defense as we make these complex issues more understandable and within reach of a wider audience. Ladies and gentlemen, over the years, the National Defense Seminar has brought together different perspectives and experiences on how to deal with common security and defense challenges. Previous editions have tackled a combination of internal priorities and global geopolitics, seeking to understand how new trends and developments could affect both national defense and international security. Today, we hold this fourth edition in a context that is marked by one defining international event and by one ongoing national process, the war in Ukraine and the revision of the national defense strategic concept. Allow me to begin with a few words on the war itself, as it continues to reach new heights of violence and destruction, evidenced by the latest attacks on Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine this week. As we witness the escalation on the ground with no easy end in sight, we are reminded that our collective security cannot be taken for granted. We are also reminded that acts of deliberate aggression and open disregard of a rules-based international order, such as those carried out by Russia on Ukraine, demand an appropriate response. As it is well known, we have steadfastly delivered on that response since February 24th onwards. We have pledged continuous support to Ukraine, either by sending much needed military equipment, by coordinating with our partners in the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, or by taking in over 57,000 refugees. We have joined the chorus of generalized condemnation of Russia's brutal aggression in every multilateral fora. We have followed through with joint efforts adopted within NATO and the European Union to reinforce transatlantic cohesion and to increase our collective deterrence posture accordingly. However, we also need to ensure that the overall reaction to such aggressions is holistic. First, our response needs not just be a reaction to the more immediate events and surroundings. It should also take upon a more all-encompassing view of the impact that this conflict carries for our existence as part of a community of shared values and principles. On Monday, the European Union approved the launch of the new assistance mission to train Ukrainian military personnel on European soil, in which Portugal will actively participate. Yet, we will be sure to match this contribution with our ongoing obligations and expectations in other areas of national interest, such as in Africa, the Atlantic, or the Mediterranean. A testament of our intent to truly adopt a 360-degree approach to security in the present world order. Second, our response to developments in Eastern Europe should not be restricted by the consequences of the war alone, a conflict that, while far-reaching in its global impact, does not exhaust the predicaments that the international community faces in other important domains. We are aware of the scale of new threats that can emerge from fast-changing scenarios, such as those emanating from the cyber domain, from the geopolitical competition in space, from the need to protect critical infrastructures, or from wide-ranging consequences of climate change. We must remain vigilant across the board and be ready to fully incorporate these issues and its different implications in our respective planning. In other words, our overall response as a state needs to be strategic at its core in terms of how to select goals, tools, and outcomes for the next few years. That requires having the capability to identify what we lack, the willingness to go beyond short-term gains, and the vision to carve out the future that we aim to achieve. It is for this reason that this year's edition of the National Defense Seminar takes place in the context of the ongoing revision of our own national defense strategic concept. Since September, a revision committee headed by Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira, who I welcome, and some other members of the group also in the audience, has been working with the goal of submitting a draft proposal by next January. In parallel, and as mentioned by Professor Isabel Nunes, a cycle of thematic events coordinated by IDN has been taking place throughout the country to collect contributions and input, which hopefully will also be included in the revision process. Amidst these efforts, we wanted to reach out and explore similar experiences undertaken by our fellow allies and partners. That is why the different sessions over the course of this morning will focus on the processes underpinning other strategic orientations ongoing or recently concluded. All countries here represented have collectively worked towards the approval of key collective documents in recent months, such as the new NATO strategic concept approved last June. All have also retained the need to express their security and defense interests in codified orientations of their own. As we consider pathways for future commitments, we believe there is great value in comparing how other attempts of this kind have been able to incorporate surrounding dynamics without losing focus of national priorities. In sum, the context we live in requires major changes in our strategies and policies, in our investments and capabilities, and in our understanding of the new strategic environment. I'm certain that the debates here today will help to ensure that our future strategies are well crafted, and more importantly, that they can be soon followed by effective results. Thank you once again for your presence. I wish you all a very productive and fruitful morning of work.
We will now begin the work proceedings of the seminar. We invite Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis to deliver a lecture on new challenges to European strategic concepts.
Minister of National Defense, Director of the National Defense Institute, ambassadors, distinguished civilian and military authorities, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Dehnhardt. I am an advisor at the National Defense Institute, and I welcome you all to the 4th edition of the Seminar on National Defense. It is my great pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker. Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis is currently assistant professor at ISCTE University Institute of Lisbon, where he teaches global history, security studies, as well as leadership and grand strategy. He was previously deputy director of the Center for International Studies and an advisor to the Portuguese Minister of Defense. He was also an advisor of the National Defense Institute from 2011 to 2019, where he was part of the working group on the revision of the National Strategic Concept of 2013. He holds a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, has an MBA and MA in Historical Studies from the University of Cambridge, and an MA in Contemporary History from the University of Lisbon. Among his recent publications are Can Portugal Have a Strategy?, Brazil versus NATO, a long-term view of maritime security in the Atlantic, in Enduring NATO, Rising Brazil, publication 2015. And he was a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of European Defense Policies and Armed Forces, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. He comments on international security and politics regularly in the mainstream media and has a regular column in the newspaper Observador, where he also hosts a weekly podcast. His keynote speech will be on the new challenges to European strategic concepts. Without further ado, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis, the floor is yours.
Just trying to keep track of time. Madam Minister of Defense, Madam Director, other senior civilian and military officials, ladies, gentlemen, others. It's always a pleasure for me to be here at IDN, at the National Defense Institute. As you've just heard, it's my also partly my house, and especially in this very distinguished company and very important initiative, the National Defense Seminar. And all the more so to discuss such a fascinating topic as the new challenges for strategy in Europe today. General George Marshall, who knew a few things about strategic planning, he was the Chief of Staff of the US Army during the Second World War, and then was appointed Secretary of State, so he was put in charge of US diplomacy just after 1945. He created the State Department Office of Strategic of Policy Planning. In his short instruction to this new institution, he made his famous recommendation: avoid trivia. This is, of course, much easier said than done, both in terms of strategic planning, strategic documents, and also of talks like this, but I will try my best. As you know, in recent months, both NATO and the EU, as was in fact already mentioned by Dr. Isabel Nunes, have issued very relevant strategic documents, and many countries in Europe have either issued their own national strategies or are in the process of doing so, as is the case also of Portugal. We will have very distinguished speakers addressing some of these strategies during this morning, so I won't go into that, but I will use mostly the EU strategic compass and also the NATO strategic concept as occasional points of reference. Let me also just preface briefly the presentation by saying that as an advisor to the Portuguese Minister of Defense, I was involved to some degree in the Portuguese contribution both to the strategic compass and also the process of revision of the NATO strategic concept. This means that alongside my own experience, which was also mentioned in national documents here in Portugal, I'm well aware of how difficult it is for the drafters of this kind of strategic document to balance different constituencies, to have an holistic enough approach to security, while at the same time keeping focus, having a clear vision, and also a realistic level of ambition in a relatively short document. And in fact, all these documents tend to be criticized either for being too ambitious, if they are holistic, or too narrow, if they are perhaps more realistic or more modest. But to go straight to the point, I've divided my talk into main sections or parts. Part one is a couple of more generic comments on the nature of these documents and also on key global trends with implications for strategy at European level. And a second part with more specific comments linked to more specific debates and maybe controversies. Hopefully, I'll leave some time for a couple of questions or comments at the end, if that is possible. In terms of more generic comments, the first one is what can we realistically expect from this type of strategic document, and is it in fact at all useful? There are some that claim that this is just basically another piece of paper of which states, and also especially the EU maybe, but also NATO already produced too many, and also primarily of interest to academics like me involved in strategic studies. I confess that this is true. This type of document is of interest to academics like me. It's very useful for someone who teaches classes in grand strategy. But I also believe that strategic doctrine guidelines are very important in providing guidance, setting priorities for very complex and increasingly complex structures. They are very important also as instruments of public scrutiny and accountability, allowing debates like the ones we are having today. In the past, of course, these two aspects were largely absent, and therefore we could have grand strategy largely done in an informal and secret way. Basically, the setting of priorities, the implementation of these priorities was in the hands of the sovereign, which was not an abstraction, but an actual person, and a core of a small group of elite advisors, which were always in close, intimate contact. This started to change from the end of the 18th century onwards, and has changed even more in more recent decades. These strategic documents are also important as an instrument of public diplomacy, signaling intent to both allies and enemies. And I would say they are especially important, even indispensable, when we are talking about a confederal, maybe partially federal union of 27 member states, the EU, or a political military organization, not simply an alliance in the conventional sense like NATO with 30 and hopefully soon to be 32 member states. This, of course, also means that the strategic compass of the EU and the strategic concept of NATO are not national strategies of a single state. We should take that into account. We cannot expect the same kind of document that we have at the national level, namely, for instance, the just recently issued national security strategy of the US. They are basically a bridging exercise between national strategies of 27 or 30 member states. This also, by the way, means that, but I, of course, will leave that to the panels that will follow. A key test of these documents in terms of implementation will actually be done, how are they implemented at the national level? So, of course, national strategies will have national priorities. They should also signal a commitment to these crucial alliances for member states. So one of the interesting things to do is to see how much we see of these larger documents, NATO strategic compass, and also the NATO strategic concept and the EU strategic compass. I knew I would make this mistake, is reflected then in the national strategies of the different member states. Second generic comment, is a fixed strategy useful in this very fast changing world? As probably some of you know, a couple of years ago in the pages of Foreign Affairs, there was this hot debate, as far as academics have hot debates, about whether we should have grand strategy, whether we should have strategic documents in the context of a fast-changing world. First of all, let me say that as an historian, I'm always a bit skeptical about this idea that this is entirely new. Yes, the world was always changing, and in the past, our ancestors also thought that it was changing fast. But I can accept that this is true to a certain degree. But I think really the answer is no. Of course, we should never have a fixed strategy. Any good strategic guidelines, any good strategic document should not be seen as some kind of holy book, as a dogma to be blindly implemented regardless of a changing reality. For it to be useful, it should always provide pointers to key dynamics, to key threats, to risks that must be watched, also identify or help identify key capability gaps that must be addressed. And of course, then also set key priorities in terms of defending core interests, which will remain despite a fast-changing world. So, of course, this does make, however, revision and adaptation much more important. And this should also be signaled in these documents. It also makes even more true, to quote another American general, Eisenhower, planning even more important than plans. And also, this highlights the importance of intelligence. Of course, we have someone here who knows a lot about intelligence. I think it's always important, but it's even more important if we think that we are in a fast-changing world. One of the very useful things, by the way, of the EU Strategic Compass was that for the first time, it was built, well, first of all, that it exists. It's the first strategic document specifically for common security and defense policy, but also that it was based on the first joint threat analysis coordinated by the EU in coordination with the National Intelligence Services of the 27. And the document also sets up regular exercises of this type of threat assessment by the intelligence services with a timetable that is left open. I think it would be useful to maybe make clear that it should be done every year, but I think that this is the right approach to the problem. The wrong approach to the problem would be something which is quite common in Portuguese strategic culture, which is do the plans, ignore them, do no strategic planning, and then just trust in improvisation, or as we call it in Portuguese, desenrasca. I think this is very useful. I'm not saying that that is not the case, but of course it cannot be the only answer. So the last generic comment, what are the main trends that we should consider, and are they taken into account in these documents? And I think that generically, yes. I think the problems come when we look at more specific points, the second part of my comments or my talk. So some quick overview. Yes, we are living in a world that is changing in terms of distribution of power. This is actually a pattern in human history, but this does not make it any less dangerous. But we are also living in a world that is where the biosphere, which we always needed to survive and have tended to see as relatively and safely unchanging, is in fact also changing in dramatic ways. We all know about climate crisis. The technosphere that we increasingly also need to survive and to thrive economically is also changing even faster than was the case in the past. And of course, this has major implications in vital areas for our security and defense. In terms of this specific transition of power, as I said, it's a pattern in human history, but what makes it especially dangerous, especially from the point of view of Europe, is that this means the end of American unipolarity. And of course, American unipolarity was not risk-free or even tension-free, but it was, if we want to be frank, very comfortable, very safe, certainly for Western Europe. So we are looking, if we are lucky, at the likely second Cold War, meaning no direct clash between great powers, which are all now nuclear powers, but a dangerously declining power like Russia, maybe, as an imminent threat to our, and very close threat to our freedom and security in Europe. And of course, an emerging or re-emerging China, which is relevant across the board, but also increasingly in military terms and in maritime terms. As you know, probably last year, the Chinese Navy for the first time has more ships than actually the US Navy. Yes, most of them are still not kind of blue water. They are not capable of projecting power globally, but they are getting there. They just launched the third aircraft carrier. They have their first overseas military bases in Djibouti since 2017. And of course, we also have the growing relevance of cyber and space. All of these aspects, I think, are, for the most part, mentioned in these new strategic documents. The problem, as I said, has to do with the specifics. So first, is this a real strategy? Are these real strategies or more of a list, a roadmap? I think that in the case of the EU strategic compass, yes, you can say that this is for the most part really a roadmap, because the EU global strategy, of course, is the main strategy. This is a subsidiary strategy. I think this is not actually a bad thing, and I do think that the strategic compass does contain a key strategic insight, which is we need to spend more jointly on defense. The problem in Europe is not that we don't spend enough on defense. In fact, if you look at the numbers and add them up, European countries spend as much as defense basically as China, much more than Russia. They are only clearly kind of overcome by the US. But the problem is, of course, we are not spending together, right? We are spending at the national level, which is, of course, perfectly legitimate. But it's obvious that we should do much better in terms of spending jointly, and especially in a coordinated way. So I think this is a crucial insight. And I believe that this is a major contribution of the strategic compass. In terms of the NATO strategic concept, I think that it's very clear in reaffirming the so-called 3 core tasks, but it's very clear that there is also rebalancing in terms of these 3 core tasks. For a long time now, the focus has been on so-called crisis management, very much in the model of counterinsurgency or military counterterrorism. Now the focus will be much more on territorial defense, with cooperative security or capacity building remaining as the third. I think that it is important, however, that this is done in a way that makes clear that territorial defense should not be understood as business as usual, as a simple return to kind of very conventional minded first Cold War, let's say, military defense. There are many references to hybrid threats, to resilience in the NATO strategic compass, and it's made clear that there will be a huge impact of so-called EDTs, emerging disruptive technology, which is a recurrent topic in both strategic documents and goes back to these dramatic changes in the so-called technosphere. It is made clear that this will have an impact across the board, including in territorial defense. Also, by the way, I would like to signal as a very, very positive aspect, specific aspect in these 2 documents, the importance that is given to maritime strategy. This is one area where I think Portugal can claim that it was very active in terms of promoting that, also in a very effective way, which is to make clear why this should be important to everyone, including to countries who do not have a coastline. And the arguments I would for that are just 2 numbers. One is today, as 500 years ago, 90% of global trade is done via the sea, via maritime routes. 60%, in fact, of intra-European trade is done via maritime routes. We just saw the dramatic consequences of that with this war in the Ukraine, in terms of energy security, in terms of food security. The other number is 90% of the data that we need for our digital economy goes through underwater cables. And we just saw how underwater infrastructures are vulnerable again in the context of this crisis with Ukraine. Second aspect, specific aspect which I like to highlight is the civilian dimension. This is very much more present in the EU strategic compass. Resilience is one of the key words there, much less so in the case of NATO. It's normal. NATO is primarily a political military organization. I still think that it's important to highlight, and I think that maybe this is not sufficiently clear yet in terms of the European Union, that for the EU to be taken seriously as a security actor, for it to be true that this frequently stated claim that the EU is uniquely equipped for crisis management because it has all the tools in this wonderful toolkit, so many civilian tools, aid to development, the ability to act in terms of prevention, but also the military tool, is really not true. You just have to look at the EU budget, the last one, which is, I was told by a former Minister of Defense, the real strategy. If you look at the EU budget, aid to development is 10 times the item for defense, the European Defense Fund, which is, again, great news. It shows that this is serious. It's the first time that it is there, but it's 10 times less than aid to development. And if we also want to be clear, it's obvious that the EU has still not been engaged in real, well, it has been engaged in very important military missions, but not in any real operational combat missions, right? So we are very far from this militarized European Union, which my colleagues in development studies fear. And this is a problem. Of course, I wanted to end with this. What is the connection between the two? What about NATO? The two documents, one of the things that they also do is point to the other as a key indispensable partner. This is done by NATO regarding the EU. This is done by the EU regarding NATO. Of course, this is in fact a condition for the existence of the strategic compass. If this was not the case, if there was any kind of doubt that the EU was not going to replace NATO as the primary security guarantor, provider of collective defense in Europe, then the strategic compass would not be approved. So this is very clear. And of course, for me, it's also very clear that, yes, NATO is the real security provider for Europe, is the key for deterrence and for defense. We just saw this with the invasion of the Ukraine. We do not improvise an alliance, much less a political military organization in time of war at your door. But should this mean that the EU should have no real military capabilities? Should strategic autonomy be a taboo? And I think that clearly the answer is no. Of course, there is no good alternative to NATO, but that doesn't mean that we should not think, even if this is very difficult, about that, precisely because we are in a fast-changing world, and precisely because the greatest threat to NATO and the EU is internal cohesion, or if you want, the reverse of that, hyperpolarization, very divisive domestic politics, which can threaten the cohesion of those alliances, which in fact have already, at least partially, threatened that cohesion. Of course, we know about Trump, but it's not the only example. Erdogan is another example in the case of NATO, and one that actually impacts directly how much the NATO and the EU can cooperate. They are very effective in doing so at, let's say, staff or senior official level. At the political level, very often, as you know, this is blocked. So we have a problem there. The good news is that actually the answer for both these problems is a more engaged EU in terms of defense and security, especially and starting by joint capabilities or coordinated capabilities development, addressing these recurrent capability gaps that we all know about. This will be indispensable if the EU wants to be taken seriously as an actor in these areas. It will also be crucial in terms of scaling up and showing actual more effective burden sharing at the level of NATO, which of course is crucial in order to avoid this fundamental risk for NATO, which is the rise of isolationism in the US. If you just follow these midterms, yes, we had some good news, not because Republicans lost or didn't gain as much as they expected, but because many Trump Republicans, isolationist Republicans lost, but some won. G.D. Vance in Ohio, was very clear saying, no, I don't want any more aid to the Ukraine. That's up to the Europeans, and Europeans have paid nothing. Of course, we know that's not true, but that shows how important it is that we are able to say that this is not true. To conclude, and leaving a few minutes for questions and comments, I would like to say that in terms of the war in Ukraine, which is of course the elephant in the room, I didn't want to go too much into that because I would get lost. For me, one thing that is not actually very clear in these documents, they keep saying there's a return of war to Europe. This is not actually the problem. We had wars in Europe in past decades, for instance, in the former Yugoslavia. And this is not the problem for Europe. The real problem, the global problem is not just are interstate wars very rare since 1945, so the invasion of Ukraine is rare already because of that, but it's in fact unique, and a unique challenge because it's the return of wars of conquest. It's the return of wars of imperial aggression and annexation. We have not seen that since 1945. And this is a challenge not just for Europe, it's a challenge for the world. But to really end, I think that probably we should thank actually Putin. I know it's maybe a challenging proposition, but there's this idea maybe we should include Stalin as one of the founding fathers of European integration, alongside De Gasperi, Spaak, Schuman, Adenauer, because he really made clear that Europeans had to hang together or they would hang separately. They would really have to change their ways if they wanted to resist this massive threat of Stalin's Soviet Union. And I think that Putin maybe forced us to rethink some of the priorities and made very clear how absolutely vital NATO is to Europeans and to the Americans and Canadians, and also how important it is that Europeans do show up in terms of defense and security and do not fall into this trap that they can remain this kind of civilian power, normative power in a world that is increasingly dangerous. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis. We have now a few more minutes to take some questions. I invite the audience to take the opportunity to ask a question. And if there is one, we can take one from Professor Isabel Nunes, please. Oh, wait, there's.
Thank you, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis, for this excellent keynote and introduction to the general topic of the second day. And I would ask you a comment on the following. The majority of current strategic documents are indeed full with expressions like striking power and the combat forces. So really a paradigm shift to a certain extent. But societies are being targeted by high inflation, high unemployment, a low cost of living, which means that support for defense spending is lower and perhaps lower than ever. How do you think we could overcome this dissonance between what we need in terms of defense to keep on being sovereign states and having the freedom to choose, and what public opinion perceives and is willing to support publicly? So how can we develop a strategy of communication, and how do we communicate these kind of strategic documents in order to convince people to take ownership of these documents? Thank you.
We have one, maybe take the first and you can answer both.
Thank you for your presentation. You touch a point, it's very interesting for me. It's about the internal cohesion in European Union and in NATO. And you speak about these entities work as allies in this to build each internal cohesion. It's interesting. We know some members are in both entities, but you know that the wartime would be crucial for this internal cohesion. And you touch also point about the role, the West role in NATO sustainability. In war, you can say, in Europe. My question is how we can do it and what can do Portugal and have this written in our strategy to help this, we can say, alliance between European Union and NATO to reinforce their internal cohesion. Thank you.
I think we
Okay,
please go
so,
ahead.
thank you very much. Very interesting questions, and of course, very difficult to answer in a synthetic way. But so the first one, how can we convince people to invest more on defense? And of course, I think the potential is there. So if you look at polls, systematically, for instance, the Eurobarometer shows that more than 70% on average of Europeans want a stronger European defense. If you look at the national level, there was this poll done by the National Defense Institute and a couple of other, so the Social Sciences Institute and I think IPRI, that also showed that the Portuguese were very concerned about a more dangerous world and thought that there should be more spending on defense. Of course, the big problem is, and this is the essence of strategy, right? So you always have limited resources, and you also have a number of important priorities, and the only priority is not just defense. In fact, we even have a name for that in strategy, which is over-strategy. If you over-invest in the military, then that's a problem, even in terms of a long-term sustainable, effective defense. But I think the potential is there. I think part of the answer is we can spend more effectively together. So this idea, precisely based on the idea, well, we should do more at the European level with allies. So if you can say, well, we are going to spend better because we are going to spend together, this will be more effective. It's also crucial in terms of showing commitment to alliances. And this goes back to the second question. I'll go there. I think another part of the answer has to do with the technology. So everyone realized that, yes, there is huge change there. So these EDTs, emerging disruptive technologies, not by accident that they keep appearing in both documents. So if we want to keep our technological edge, we have to invest more. And in fact, this is central in the Western way of war. You know, going back to my shoe as an historian, you know, this is the distinguishing feature of the Western way of war. Since for centuries, the West has always been used to fighting with a technological edge. If this is no longer the case, then it will be a massive change in terms of the way we are used to conduct military operations. And of course, it's also crucial for interoperability, right? So if you want to keep operating effectively, maybe with the United States, we need that. And I think that the context does help. So I think that, again, if you look at the polls, there seems to be significant jumps in support for NATO, for European security. So I think that people have realized that, you know, yes, security is like oxygen. You only notice that it's so important when it's missing, right? So the fact that we have this massive, aggressive power very close to us, Russia, does make it easier in a way to sell. But it's always a problem. And I would end with this final point, which is to say, I think it's also important to be able to argue that this is not just expenditure. This is actually investment, and also investment in the economy, the national economy, in technological innovation. You know, in a way, it's the US model. You know, why can the US keep such a significantly higher level of investment in defense? It has to do with strategic and political culture, but it also has to do with, this is basically a national industrial policy. It's a massive investment into the US economy, into US industry. And I think that at the EU level, there is realization that this is the case. So the importance of having a degree in these joint projects and in joint procurement, having a degree of geographical diversity, having room for SMEs, because this is also important in terms of innovation, but also in terms of political sustainability. It will be much harder to sell, for instance, in Portugal, the idea that we have to invest more in defense, if this is going to just be, you know, we are going to import very expensive capabilities from the United States or from a couple of European countries. If you can argue, like the new transport plane, which is a very important capability, by Embraer, if you can argue this is actually also a contribution to the national economy, I think that's much easier to make the case. And there's of course an obvious linkage with the second question, which is, you know, really very hard. How do you keep this internal cohesion between within NATO, within the EU? We live in times of hyperpolarization in terms of identity politics. So that's a fundamental challenge. So part of the answer has to do with national political dynamics, which are very difficult to control. We know that this is often associated with times of crisis, with the perception of ineffective elites, with so-called economic volatility. So the expectations of people are not met. So there's a structural element there, which I think is difficult to fight, but I think that the role of leaders is crucial there. They have to explain, which is of course what some of them are not doing. You know, Trump is the paradigmatic example, Erdogan is another example, that we are of course much stronger together, that it's not just a matter of paying money into NATO, for instance, which was an argument that Trump kept using, which is of course ridiculous. The amount that you actually send to the central budget, let's say, of NATO is completely irrelevant. We are investing in our national military capabilities, and then it's in our national interest we will be much more effective, much stronger if we use them in a coordinated way with our partners and allies. So I think, you know, there is no easy, simple answer or recipe. But I think that the role of national leaders is crucial there. If they do exactly the opposite, if they play the nationalist card, then we are in trouble. And of course, it's not even necessarily the case that NATO will disappear or the EU will disappear, but there is the serious risk that they will be paralyzed, that they will be much more ineffective. And I think this is especially dramatic in the context of the world that we are living today. You know, I think that the rise of China, the rise of other powers does not have to be a terrible thing. But I think that in order for Europe to have a voice in this much more multipolar world, we really have to stick together. Because, you know, I'll quote here Paul-Henri Spaak, this Belgian prime minister, defense minister, one of the first secretary generals also of NATO, that used to say, you know, there are only two kinds of powers in Europe. Small powers that realize that they are small powers, and small powers that have not yet realized that they are small powers. And so I would conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruno Cardoso Reis. Your presentation was an excellent way to set the stage for the work of the next two panels on the national security strategies. And you highlighted very well the dimension of both NATO and EU for setting this stage. And I think the main message and conclusion was that we Europeans, we have to finally get our act together, that there is not really a point, there is a point of no return, whether it was the war in Ukraine, which certainly has been a catalyst for this new development, but regardless of that, also the end of American unipolarity. So these two factors, in a very differentiated way, of course, highlight the need for us Europeans to work more closely together, to do it in a joint way, to do it in a coordinated way. And I think also as the previous presentations or comments have shown by the defense minister and the director of the National Defense Institute, is the importance of nationally elaborated, constructed documents, whether they are white papers, whether they are national security strategies, whether there are review papers, but the importance to think these things in a strategic manner, to do it with different stakeholders who need to be engaged, and ultimately, as was pointed out, also by including civil society, which in our democratic regimes obviously takes center stage in terms of the role that they play in being included in the consideration and the elaboration of these strategy documents. So thank you very much once again, and we'll continue straight away with the next, with the first panel. Thank you very much.
The first panel under the topic Compare Strategic Concepts, United Kingdom and the Netherlands will now begin.
I would now like to welcome you to our first panel and greet the audience here at the National Defense Institute, and also greet whomever is online. And in particular, one of our speakers, Dr. Christian Wood, who will join us by video conference. It is an honor for me to chair this panel on the strategic concepts of the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. Both countries have recently adopted their new strategic documents. The UK adopted its integrated defense review entitled Global Britain in a Competitive Age in March 2021, a year after the outbreak of the global COVID pandemic and amidst the rising great power competition between the United States and China. The Netherlands, for its turn, adopted its defense white paper entitled A Stronger Netherlands, Essay for Europe, in June 2022, 4 months after the outbreak of Russia's war against Ukraine and the return of military conflict in Europe. Both defense documents were adopted in the context of a multiplicity of overlapping challenges, as we've heard this morning, from shifting global power balances and competition between democracies and autocracies, to climate change and global changing demographics, from rapidly emerging technological innovations to food and energy insecurity, all of which have in common that they challenge or threaten the existing international rules-based order of the last 30 years. One result is the sharp increase in uncertainty and unpredictability that national governments have to deal with, and which has led many European countries, and also NATO and the EU, recently adopting new strategic documents. One could thus make the case that solid strategic planning has become even more important for decision makers when elaborating the national strategies, and more crucial in the realm of security and defense. How European countries have developed their national security and defense guidelines and published them, which stakeholders were involved and how they influenced the process. Is the balance right between the stated ambitions and the financial means and operational capabilities? And what are old and new strategic priorities are some of the issues that this panel will address with regard to the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. It is my pleasure to introduce the first distinguished speaker of this panel, who, as I said, is joining us by video conference. Dr. Christian Wood is Assistant Head for Strategy Development, working to Deputy Director of Strategic Development. As part of the leadership team for Defense's update to the integrated review and the Defense Command paper, he was responsible for developing the Defense's overarching strategic vision. He was the lead official for engagement with partners and allies The defense's public strategic narrative and strategic relationship with Parliament and external organizations. Prior to this position, he was a graduate of the civil service fast stream, involving roles in international trade as a private secretary in MOD and supporting FTAs. Before joining the civil service, he had a career in politics, working as an MP's chief of staff and senior advisor on foreign affairs and defense. Before I give him the floor, some housekeeping rules. As you've heard, the session is being recorded. And for the Q&A sessions, we will take, of course, questions from the audience, but we will also take questions from the other speakers who are online and whom I welcome to ask questions directly, and for that purpose to then turn on the camera when they signaling that they would like to do so. So the indication I've received is that each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll initiate the Q&A period. So Dr. Christian Wood, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I first of all check if you can hear me? All right.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, thank you. I'm conscious of time as well. I probably won't take up 20 minutes, but first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you very much for inviting myself and the Ministry of Defence. You've touched on a few points in your introduction, but I first thought it'd be useful to set out the integrated review and then how that actually transcends into how Defence does strategy. So we view this almost, you could look at it like a pyramid. So the integrated review is the government's overarching vision for the UK over the next 10 years. It takes our national interest and tries to see how we can promote UK interests, project UK influence, and most importantly, protect the nation. But it is a strategy that encompasses the whole of government and not just the Ministry of Defence. So it takes our economic strategy, our diplomatic strategy, our cultural strategy, our trade, and our information, as well as military. And as you correctly pointed out, it was published last year and recognised, we like to feel that the UK was slightly ahead of the game in recognising that the unprecedented challenges and geopolitical shifts that we're witnessing in the world had led to a deteriorating global security environment. We also recognised, for example, that there was a growing importance in the Indo-Pacific, and that was critical to us securing global prosperity and security, whilst also recognising that we were seeing an intensifying competition between states and also a widening range of security threats. And by that, unfortunately, we mean that it was not as if you looked at our integrated review in 2010 and 2015, it very much focused on non-state actors, on counterterrorism. And it wasn't that those threats had diminished, but unfortunately other threats had increased. And finally, also, we recognized that the integrated review, we found ourselves at a time of rapid technological change. And it was very important for the UK to be a leader in that and to get ahead of the game. And from that, the IR set out 4 overarching objectives up to 2025, which I'll just briefly touch on. So 1, sustaining strategic advantage through science and technology. 2, shaping the open international order of the future. 3, strengthening security at home and overseas. And 4, building resilience at home and overseas. And I think the last one is particularly interesting because that was amended. The integrated review usually is published every 5 years, but we delayed ours by a year in order to take into account the lessons learned from COVID, and also recognizing that we had a domestic resilience had grown to the fore following the impact and the pressures which we had seen on our domestic services following the pandemic. And significantly, that also was underpinned by a defense command paper, which is what my team was responsible for. So by that, I mean, so the integrated review is written by the Cabinet Office, by Number 10, but all parties across government contribute to it. But it's a central document that is publicly owned by the Prime Minister, and therefore we in Defence do not write the pen on that. But following the integrated review, Defence also was given a comprehensive settlement for the next 4 years in 2020, an additional investment of over 24 billion, which at the time was the largest investment Defence had since the end of the Cold War. And recognising that this certainty gave us an opportunity to reform and renew our armed forces, and in order to prepare and deliver on the ambition set out in the IR, our Defence Secretary requested that Defence also publish a Defence command paper. And the Defence Command Paper had 3 particular points which I wanted to touch on. It outlined how defence must prepare for more persistent global engagement and constant campaigning. So it really outlined how we would be on the forefront and we would be shaping the open international order of the future, how we would move from a position of just defending our nation, but to ensuring that we are strengthening our deterrence and are becoming an increasingly adaptable and integrated ally to our partners, not just in Europe and in NATO, but around the world. We also, therefore, that led to a change in our concept that we wanted to be able to intervene and fight more rapidly and more decisively. So we are more agile, but we are leaner, but more lethal. It also doubled down on our commitment to science and technology and research and development. That was underpinned by a 6.6 billion allocation to accelerate research and development to drive strategic advantage. We recognize that when we are looking at defense, we chose in the Defense Command Paper to sunset certain capabilities and really enhance our sub-threshold threats, our cyber capabilities, and ensure that we had a decisive edge as a global science power. And finally, the Defense Command Paper underpinned our commitments to our allies and partnerships. It reaffirmed that NATO is the cornerstone of not just Europe's security, but also the UK's security, but it also signaled a willingness and intention to expand our collaboration and cooperation through industrial partnerships with like-minded partners and allies across the world, recognizing that the malign threats which we recognize in the Defence Command Paper and the Integrated Review were manifesting itself not just close to home, but across the world. And it's our duty to be a responsible power and to uphold the international order, to be present in multiple domains. And finally, I also then wanted to also touch that following the Defence Command Paper, we also have an internal strategy, which is classified and actually directs. So this is almost the third layer in the pyramid, and that is the defense strategy. And so the defense strategy, which was also published this year, takes the Defence Command Paper, the Integrated Reviews, and recognizes the vision which they set out and gives them specific outcomes and objectives which direct the rest of the department. So that was a significant change, and it was something which, when I was thinking about what I was going to speak today, I really wanted to focus on, is we've moved away from outputs. So we've moved away from just, say, measuring the amount of operations we do or the amount of tanks which have been built, but it leads to outcomes. And by that we mean we want to measure and understand the changes which we want to see in the world, as well as the changes which we want to see in our organization. And by having an overarching strategy that focused on these outcomes, it allowed us to identify the key areas where we want to really focus, changing the way and how our department functions. And by that, and I touched on it in the Defence Command Paper, that was deterrence, that was also modernization and transformation, and finally, that was integration. So that is bringing together all of our frontline commands in order to be able to work more closely under one integrated operating concept, and to make sure that they are everything that they are doing and everything that teams in defense are doing are all working to this overarching vision. And in having this defense strategy, which was published, it's normally published 4 years, and it sets out our vision for the next 8 years, we've done something quite different this year. We've chosen to try to adapt something called an adaptive strategy. So we are constantly, within my team, within strategy development and within the Ministry of Defence's strategic hub, which has been recently set up following the creation of the defense strategy, we are seeking to constantly evaluate and interpret what difference we are making in the world, and more importantly, what is the threat and how is that changing? So our constant aim in our strategy is always to be threat-led, and by that gives us the opportunity to amend and change and give a new direction to our seniors and to the rest of defense each year. We use this through something which we're calling a strategic cycle, which is constantly monitoring and evaluating our progress, is seeking to understand the lessons learned from conflicts such as we've seen this year, most prominently in following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but also to understand, for example, the success of, say, certain deployments. So, for example, the landmark Carrier Strike 21 deployment in the Indo-Pacific. And in doing that, we are seeking to kind of move away from the process where strategy is just a big public document that is left on a shelf and then is there to collect dust, but is a live document and is something that is constantly informing defense. And by that, we are finding that as strategists, we are able to work much more closely with our operational teams, with our policy experts who have the subject matter expert and the relationship with particular issues. And we are constantly ensuring that we are not just led by almost the financial implications and the capabilities and the operational requests at the time, but are always strategically driven. And as I've said, we have noticed that although we recognized in the integrated review in the Defense Command paper that the world was deteriorating and that competition was intensifying, I think we can all agree, and I resonated when listening to the previous speaker, that the world has deteriorated at a pace which the integrated review did not foresee, and which I don't think our allies and partners foresaw. And that is something in how we are therefore taking that at heart and trying to adapt. And the former Prime Minister, Elizabeth Truss, in her short tenure, therefore actually commissioned an update to the integrated review announced at the UN General Assembly. So my team right now is working with Number 10, who again are we have an academic, Professor John Bew, who is writing an update to the integrated review, but we will be publishing, hopefully by the end of the year, an updated public document, which could be seen as a second chapter, which recognizes that broadly, the integrated review remains extant, and the vision set out under those 4 pillars remains the UK's driving ambition for the next 10 years. But we recognize that we must have a sharpening of the focus towards certain threats, most predominantly recognizing that we have a very aggressive and volatile Russia, which is directly causing war in Europe. And we must therefore be more resilient, and we must be more ready to deter these threats and double down on our commitments to our allies and partners. And so taking that, our team is writing not just an integrated review, but also our Defense Secretary has also, following that, has again commissioned an update to our Defense Command paper. So not only did we publish our Defense Command paper last year, but we will be publishing another update to that following in the spring, following a spending review, which again will therefore align with the financial settlement which Defence receives in the new year, which aligns with Defence's recognition that due to the threats, it is important that we increase our defence budgets. And this aligns with obviously the Defence Secretary's commitments that he has made to seek to receive 2.5% to ensure that the 2% NATO GDP target is the floor and not the ceiling. And will therefore also update and ensure that our armed forces are not just ready to fight the threats today, but also are again ready to have a modernized force, ready to fight the threats in 2030. And will also, I think, more importantly, address some of the hollowing out, which the Defence Command paper almost signaled, but will almost row back on that in 2026 to ensure that we have an armed forces that are actually ready to fight, to deter all of the threats, not just in Europe, but also potentially if we see aggression in other parts of the world. I'll stop there, and because I'm conscious that that is quite a broad overview of what Defence is doing, and I'm very happy to, whether it's to discuss any specific questions about what our strategy says, or whether you'd like to discuss about how within Defence, how we try to do strategy. I'm very happy to, whatever the audience would prefer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christian Wood, for giving us this update on the idea and the plan of an update of the integrated review still this year. And I'm sure this will raise a couple of questions, which I will also then pose. Now we'll pass on to the second speaker before opening the Q&A session. And our second speaker, who I welcome, is Lieutenant Colonel Peter Marks, who is an infantry officer within the Netherlands Armed Forces. His expertise lies mainly in the field of operations and in policy plans and strategy. During his career, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Marks has led multiple infantry units. He has been deployed several times to Afghanistan and to Iraq. At the staff of the Netherlands Army, He worked on the further development of the army within the armed forces. Since 2019, Peter Marks is employed in the strategy department of the Directorate General for Policy at the Ministry of Defense, a department responsible for the political strategic direction of the Netherlands Ministry of Defense. Important products of this department are the Netherlands Defense Vision, the Netherlands Defense White Paper, and the strategic concept. These documents indicate the direction in which the Dutch defense will develop. The strategic direction ultimately translates into operational concepts, organization structures, and capabilities for the armed forces. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Marks, it's my pleasure to give you the floor.
Minister of Defense, Director, Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. I think the seminar and also your distinguished presence today underlines the need we all feel for more cooperation, which normally starts or at least is helped by strategy. So I'm really honored to be a small part of that today. I don't know if my presentation can be. Oh, because today I'm going to tell you a little bit not about the process or the contents of the Dutch strategy, but mainly why we felt the need to design a more political a military strategy, and because that helps you to understand why it's aimed not mainly at only military problems, but also on more worldwide problems or societal problems like climate change and the military role within that. And it's also helps you to understand why it's not only aimed on capacity building, but also on how the military relates to the Dutch public and to our partners. And also the dilemmas which come with that. And I will do that by, in 20 minutes, explain you first why we felt the urgency, what we did within the ministry to address the urgency we felt, and how it translates into the strategy we published recently, but also 2 years ago. And one of the things, this is quite a side note, but it's important to understand, is the picture you see, is that, of course, the Netherlands is based within Europe, but the Ministry of Defense of the Netherlands has a responsibility for the whole kingdom. And we have also a Caribbean part of our kingdom. So next to our partners within NATO, within EU and our neighbors, Germany, the UK, Belgium, we have also other neighboring countries. France in the Caribbean is directly neighboring the Netherlands or the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but we also need to address problems which come with the presence of, for instance, Venezuela or other problems within the Caribbean. And there's also a responsibility for the Dutch MOD. So we have to take that into account. It's quite a small side note, but it is important to understand the choices we make. But first of all, the urgency, like I told you. Therefore, I go back to the period directly after 2014. Of course, as defense strategists and planners, we all recognized the shift in 2014 when Russia annexed the Crimea. But in the Netherlands, we also addressed in our strategic papers that we thought a game changer, but we didn't see a lot of that translated into public opinion and also within the political debate. And the graphs which are on my slide shows you a little bit of the problem we experienced, because on the left side you saw it's in Dutch. Sorry for that, I didn't have an English version, but for the idea, this graph shows within a survey around the Dutch public where they find the priority to invest public and tax money in. And you see that although this is a sheet of 2017, there were a lot of worldwide problems, climate change already, a lot of instability around or also in Europe, the Crimea, like I mentioned, but the defense is encircled on the slide, was very low on the priority in the priorities of the Dutch public. Very high are, of course, healthcare, integration, education, big problems or big issues also in the Netherlands, important, but also defense, as you can imagine, is also important. And that translated also into a decline of defense budgets from 1990 approximately towards 2014, 15, 16. So we experienced, on the one hand, a world which is deteriorating. We published quite a lot of papers about it, and I think quite good papers also, but we saw that that didn't translate into the feel of urgency into the public. So we had trouble to reach the public and the public opinion and also the political opinion. So we analyzed what was the problem with that. And first of all, there was a political perception that investing in defense, and I put it quite hard on the slide, is a black hole. And that's not because the urgency wasn't felt or there were no issues with safety or security, but was mainly because we as a MOD didn't succeed in showing in what an investment does with, for instance, our capacities. So the link between the investment and the readiness, for instance, wasn't clear enough. So that made it very hard for our Dutch politics to really invest heavily in defense, because it's hard to translate how public money relates to readiness or deployability. And that was a real problem. And also the societal perception was, there was a lot of support for the military. Dutch operations in Afghanistan, for instance, or in Iraq, translated into well, a lot of respect for soldiers in the Dutch public opinion. But it didn't translate it into the feel of urgency for Dutch security problems or for the need to invest in the defense organization. So that were things we had to address better. Therefore, we decided we had to invest in a more security, defense, more political military strategy, which addresses the public and also the politicians better, and underlines the need of a strong defense for the Dutch security problems, but also for the economic position of the Netherlands and Europe, better than that we did in the past. So we had to invest in a dialogue between the ministry or the military and the society, but also businesses, politics, partners within the Netherlands, within the Caribbean, within the EU, NATO, in dependability, that the euros that are spent in the MOD are well spent euros, in visibility within the Netherlands, because I'm sure it's in your countries also, all our military bases are on locations where the public don't live. So we have to invest in visibility of the armed forces in the Netherlands. People have to see more of the military because that shows also what we do with public money. And we had to invest in a strong brand, independability, but also that the military is not only for missions abroad, but also for national security, and is an essential component in Europe and for the security of European people and therefore the Dutch people. Therefore, and like my colleague from the UK, we designed a strategic cycle, which is linked to our parliamentary cycle, which is normally 4 years. You can forget about the picture later on, but what is important is that it is a cycle, so that we are constantly thinking about strategy, and that we have two main moments in that strategic cycle. And one is the defense vision. We published that 2 years ago, and it's normally it's published around halfway down the parliamentary cycle. And that's an opportunity we take to assess the world around us, assess the situation within the Dutch armed forces, design what is needed within the next 15, 20 years to address all the problems from now, but also in the future, and how we can come there. That document is not funded. It's merely strategic and helps us in our public dialogue, but also in our dialogue with Dutch politics about what is, from an expert opinion, needed for the defense organization for development. After that, of course, in the Netherlands, elections will happen, a new cabinet will take place. They design a coalition agreement, and we translate that coalition agreement into a defense white paper, and that is actually funded. So there is the planning for the defense forces for the next 4 years, at least, but how we will spend our budget and how we will handle the direction we got in the coalition agreement. And that was actually the document we published last year. So when you put that on time, first of all, we published the defense vision, which you see on the left. We called it Defense Vision 2035 because that was the scope of the vision in October 2020. And we put there 3 important messages. And important to understand also, side note, is that all these documents are published from our cabinet. So all the ministers signed for the defense vision and the defense white paper. Of course, it's designed by the Ministry of Defense, but it's a document which is published on behalf of all our cabinet. We stated 3 things. One of all is that at this moment, 2 years ago, the Dutch defense wasn't able, not adequately equipped to address all the security problems and all the things the government demanded from us, also within our obligations in the law. And that, of course, you can understand that was quite a statement. And it's true, because a lot of the budget cuts in the last 20 years, the demands are growing. So the balance between the budget on the one hand and the demands on the other hand, well, there was no balance anymore. So it was true, but the statement was very important also within the societal discussion. We needed, for all the demands, we analyzed 13 to 17 billion extra. So there's more than double from the Dutch defense budget, which was 11 to 12 billion at that moment. And of course, we knew, and we also put it in the document, that we didn't get that amount of money. And we cannot process that amount of money in a short time as well. But what we said in the document that if you invest in the defense more than you do now, but not the 30 to 70 billion. We have to start the dialogue on political level because it's a political mandate about what risks you are about to accept or mitigate on another way with military. And that's a discussion within society, within public, which we put in our defense vision. And we need long-term political commitment on budget, but also on policy. And after that, the real discussion in society and also within our politics began with the MOD, but also within society, and also helped, of course, by some real heavy security problems developing in Europe, but also before Ukraine happened. In our coalition agreement, our government decided to invest 3 billion more in the Dutch defense organization because there was the need felt within our government to invest more in defense, but mainly to invest more in European security and cooperation, and the need that the Dutch military, Dutch government has to step up also within that responsibility. But after Ukraine happened, an additional 2 billion was invested. So now we are working towards a defense budget of about 80 billion, which is 40% more than 2 years ago. So that's a huge assignment for the Dutch defense forces, but it is, well, as you can imagine, highly needed. Last on this slide, some fundamental choices. I'm sure you recognize it within your own strategic problems. But for us, the need to step up as the Netherlands, but also as Europe, for taking responsibility in own security issues was priority one within designing our strategy. It was also in the coalition agreement, and therefore also a guiding principle within designing the Dutch defense strategy. But that is very fundamental. I mean, you see when you read our strategic papers that all over the red line is that we have to invest in cooperation to make Europe stronger, the EU stronger, and also NATO by doing that stronger. But therefore, we also had some fundamental dilemmas within designing our strategy. First of all, is the urge to grow versus the investing in the fundamental basis. We had a lot of gaps in our organization due to budget costs, due to choices made. And there was a lot of need to repair that. But also the security situation demands a growth of some capabilities, new capabilities, but also old capabilities. So there was quite a dilemma. I'll show you later on what we decided to do. Tooth versus tail. So are you going to invest heavily in combat forces or in the support of combat forces? Because of course, again, security problems, a lot of needs are with the fighting units, the combat units. But if you don't have adequate support for the combat units, they become more less effective. So there's also a need to address the tail, a big need. And in the Dutch forces, there was a real big need to address the tail. And a dilemma, which is also kind of a side note, is the target audience for the white paper, because we had to address a lot of stakeholders. First of all, society, politics, to show them what we think the best way to develop the armed forces are, our partners, internationally and nationally, but also, of course, our armed forces self, because it's the guideline for them in the next few years to develop their own part of the organization, and that's quite a difficult target audience, because all audiences need different things for their understanding, but it's all addressed within one document. So the choices we made overall, and I think in the opening speech that was addressed also strongly, is that the overarching goal for us is to step up as Netherlands, develop our armed forces, repair a lot of readiness and deployability issues we have, and therefore be a better partner within Europe, within the EU, within NATO. There's also a big red line which wholly is focused on cooperation. Cooperation with our partners, closest partners like Germany, the UK, Belgium, Norway, United States, but also within the EU and within the NATO, because we really believe that cooperation, and I'm really happy that this is addressed almost by every speaker today. We really think that the only possibility to address all the security issues Europe is going to face in the future, is facing now, but is going to face in the future, is by working far more closely together on capacity building, on integrating our forces than we do right now. And so our security strategy is based on stepping up as a Netherlands by improving our readiness and deployability, strongly investing in the support of Dutch forces, so support units, but also supplies and stocks. And therefore, in the strengthening all units, we targeted improve a few units combat power, which we think are some missing links within Europe, like rocket and air defense units. And we invest heavily in agility by putting a lot of money in our intel chain, but also our command chain and information maneuver units. So that, in short, concludes my my briefing, not about the choices, not only about the choices we made, but hopefully this helps you to understand, well, on the one hand, the choices we made, but the urge we felt to cross the bridge between the military on one hand and the military analysis and the public debate within the Netherlands, but within Europe. And we really think that is necessary because we have to address the future security problems, not only as a military, but as a society. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Marks. That was a very detailed explanation and presentation of how the Netherlands have developed their strategy. We are running a few minutes late, but we still have about 7 to 8 minutes for the Q&A session. I have a couple of questions, but I also see there is one question in the audience. Maybe we'll take one question, and then if there's time, I'll still add one question.
Thank you very much for very interesting talks. I had a generic question for both, which is, do you see any avenues for bilateral cooperation with Portugal in terms of your strategic priorities? I did notice that in the integrated review, Portugal was mentioned as a potential partner. And a specific question which has to do with choices that were made because of money. So, you know, in Britain, of course, there's all this talk about austerity. So did that have an impact in terms of some of the implementation of the priorities that were mentioned? And in terms of the Netherlands, what was the logic behind the choices? Can you go a bit into that? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other question? If not, if I may add, One specific question to regarding the UK's defence strategy, because if we look at the strategic review, it did focus quite a lot on a sort of Indo-Pacific tilt. And so maybe one lessons learned would be that one shouldn't focus too much on geographical areas in terms of prioritizing, because of course the war in Ukraine has refocused the UK strategic focus, at least in the medium term. So that would be one question. And another one would also be whether, and you have highlighted this, of course, the need to engage more or you suggested it, the need to engage also more multilaterally, because the UK has been advancing bilateral agreements, for example, with Germany last year, also with Portugal. So would the new context of return of war in Europe sort of make the case for an institutionalization of the UK's relationship with the EU at the level of security and defense? And then one question very quickly to the Netherlands in terms of its strategy. Of course, it being an Atlanticist country as Portugal, as Denmark, how do you look at the UK post-Brexit? I mean, definitely the war in Ukraine has highlighted the need for the partnership, but I wonder to what extent and how you engage. Of course, cooperation, maritime cooperation with Belgium is very strong. Cooperation at the level of the army between Germany and the Netherlands is very strong. Do you see a particular domain, for example, air power, in terms of cooperation with the UK? Thank you very much. And Dr. Wood, I'll let you answer first.
Thank you. I'll turn to the first question on strategic dialogue. I completely agree. It is one part of the role my team and my directorate seeks to do is to engage strategically with our partners and allies. We try to provide support to like-minded nations when they are going through their own strategic reviews, and we also seek their inputs into our strategic dialogue. Our team is constantly engaging with partners and allies, and that's why we see the value of forums such as these, and we take that in, I think, and take that back into when we are developing our strategy. I think one thing which we have learned, and we are really trying to change our culture in defense, is that if you are too close-minded and you are too internal in your thinking, your strategy is worse. So not only with allies and partners, but also with academics, with think tanks, with externals, we are really trying to actually reach out and be a lot more wide and expansive with who we engage with. But also we recognize that a strategy will only go so far if it has the support of its allies and partners. It goes back to the point, as I was saying, and touches on the fourth question as well, that we recognize in particular that alliances and partnerships and working with our allies is at the heart of what we do. We must be greater than some of our parts in defense, and interoperability, I think, is going to be critical to remain threat-led. So yes, and I should also say, I mean, more broadly, we have a very close relationship with our Portuguese counterparts through our Portuguese defense attaché and through our team. But if you ever do want to have bilateral engagements with our strat team, please do not hesitate to reach out. On the second question about financial constraints, you are spot on. I mean, I said obviously in my speech that we had the largest investment since the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, we must be pragmatic and recognize that the delivery and economic climate that we now find ourselves in is much more pessimistic and much more challenging. And that in turn has some challenges on our delivery of our strategy. And that gets to the heart of what I mean by having the strategic cycle. We're able to adapt to these constraints and therefore amend our strategy. But we also recognize that we also can't just almost be guided by cuts and guided by short-term economic challenges. We must ensure that we have a vision, which is why, although we find it a challenge, we also think it increases the importance of having strategy. And that is why the government itself will be publishing the update to the integrated review to ensure that even though the next 2 years, as the Chancellor said in the autumn statement yesterday, will be challenging, we have a clear vision for the next 10 years. Turning to your third question on the Indo-Pacific tilt, it goes back, we get this a lot. It goes back with the fact that the integrated review is part of the government's wider agenda. And the IP tilt we see as far more of an economic tilt. You can see that in the UK's desire and its steps to accede to the CPTPP FTA, to sign economic agreements with Japan, with Singapore. Defense is but one lever in this wider tilt and is actually playing a much more small role. The Defense Command Paper is very clear that the Euro-Atlantic remains the #1 priority and is our main area of interest. It also, as the Defense Command Paper also sets out, that our commitments in the Middle East remain steadfast and extant. And although Carrier Strike Group 21 was a landmark deployment, and we have also permanently deployed 2 other vessels out in the Pacific, I think you can see that we are trying to deliver the Indo-Pacific tilt, not through putting steel holes in the Pacific, but through pursuing economic partnerships in defense as well. You can see that with FCAS, with our relationship with Japan, and also with AUKUS, with our landmark alliance with Australia and the US. So I think I would like to say to our European allies and partners, and I think it has been reaffirmed by our response and our commitment to NATO and our support to Ukraine, that the Euro-Atlantic is, as the Secretary of State said it 2 weeks ago, is our home beat, and that is not going to change. And then finally on that as well, multilateralism, I agree. It goes back to my point about interoperability. I think that you will see in the Defence Command Paper update and in the Integrated Review update, a reassertment of the UK's commitment to be a credible and reliable ally and a leader within these partnerships. The UK is proud of its leading role in NATO and will remain steadfast in that, but also will continue to work more closely in multilateral alliances with our European partners. And I think you can look to with our northern allies the success of the JEF as an example of where, when you bring like-minded partners together, you can actually deliver real change.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, please allow me to reflect on the logic between the choices we made, because it's based on, I think about 2 pillars. First of all, and I mentioned it in my presentation also, is we really felt the need to step up as Netherlands, because as quite a big economy within the EU and also within NATO, we feel the responsibility for quite a broad defense capability. So not focused on one specific capacity, but a lot of capacity like we have at the moment. Therefore, we invested a lot in making our deployability faster, longer and more. So we want to make our units able to deploy faster, to deploy longer, and to deploy more. So that is the logic behind investing a lot in our tail. Let's say that. So our support units, our stocks, because that really increases the deployability, but also the readiness of our units. And the second one, and I mentioned it also in my presentation, is based fully on cooperation within the Dutch Kingdom with our security partners nationally, but mainly with our international partners within the EU, within NATO, but also bilateral. So a lot of choices we make are based upon facilitating that cooperation. And then your question about the UK and post-Brexit and how we think about that. And I think our opinion is, quite easy, because the UK has been and is a very important security partner for us. We share the sea. We are neighbors. And I think also post-Brexit, the UK is a very important security partner within Europe. We are European allies. So I think that doesn't make a difference for defense cooperation, or shouldn't make a difference, and at least in the perception of the Netherlands. we are fully committed also to cooperate with the UK as well as our other strategic partners in the future. And we do that strategically. We have people on the UK DCDC, so we cooperate literally on our assessments. But also we join in JEF. We have the Marines cooperate closely, Navy cooperation, Army cooperation. So I only see that, I don't see that different posts or pre-Brexit, because the security situation in Europe has a need for all European allies within EU, but also with other close allies to cooperate more than we do now. And I think this is only an example of that.
Thank you. We have no more time to take more questions, unfortunately. I would like to thank both speakers for their excellent presentations and for taking the time to respond to the questions. We will now do a short break of 10 minutes, and I invite you to join the second panel, which will be on the comparative analysis between the strategies and the strategic documents of Denmark, Spain, and Germany. Good morning. Thank you very much.
Obrigado.
We'll resume at 11:40.
I hear whether there is, and as the UK itself has been pursuing bilateral agreements with Germany and with Portugal, for example, whether there was something being held at the level of the Netherlands.
Actually, we joined in JEF, so all domains we work closely with the UK. Actually, we joined the UK once in a 2 year with
Exactly. Yes.
So that's one of the we joined it last year, and then every 2 years.
Exactly. So next year. Yeah. No, this was a bit in the sense of the Atlanticist countries, whether there would be some rationale also not invalidating all the other formats, but sort of because we're Atlanticist countries, to what extent we should really focus on advancing certain initiatives in that sense. I think there's a, because of course the Eastern European countries plus Germany have certain sorts of yes, I'll be
I think
Nice to meet you. Pleasure. Nice to meet you.
thank you very much. Yeah, I think we focus with Army cooperation on our eastern neighbors, but I think maritime Portugal is really within Europe taking a leading role.
yes, it's very.
So I think the cooperation on naval really important in the future between Atlantic countries like you said. Is completely stationed in Romania right now. Also after Ukraine. We are facing right now. When the beginning we deployed our F-35s the first time, but towards Poland. They are now replaced, so we succeeded in sending the F-35s instead of the F-16s. It was the first deployment for them, so that was nice. Of course, the reason is that yeah, sure.
Som, dois.
Só se for.
Som.
Para verificar aqui.
Tudo. Está destruído. Foi comer um cafezinho? Está a comer dois, mal é esse. Aqueles ali que ainda são.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please, Ambassador Zima Jones, please, could you please open your videos? Thank you. Good morning. I'm Colonel João Barbas. I will be the moderator of the session. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
May I ask, I'm not listening you, please. Sorry. Sorry. Okay, now I have sound. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, loud and clear. Great. Okay. I think you will. You will be the first speaker of the panel. Is it okay for you, sir?
That's fine. Yes.
Okay. Are you planning to use any PowerPoint or not?
No PowerPoint from me.
Okay,
no.
very well. Thank you. I will do a short introduction to you, of you when we start, and then I will hand over the floor to you. I think Professor Isabel Nunes discussed with you to have a 15-20 minute slot for your communication. Is that okay for you, sir?
That is fine. Yes.
Okay, very well. Thank you, sir. May I now speak with Dr. Pierre, please? Are you in, madam? Okay. We'll start in a few minutes. I will now mute my sound.
Sim, já está desde as 9 horas.
Participa?
E está só a ver. Houve muito alto ruído, as pessoas não se ouvem. Portanto, se eles vão trazê-los para ter. Ninguém está a ouvir lá. Diz? Não seja um emprego agora. Deixa eu mudar agora. Yep. Vamos ver. Canal aberto. Esse é de cima. You already confirmed your presentation. My presentation is there. It's uploaded. Okay. Okay. Nice to meet you. Tá bem, tá bem. Please have a seat.
We will in a few seconds. Please take your seats. The second panel, under the topic Compare Strategic Concepts, Denmark, Spain, and Germany, will now begin.
Good morning, Madam Minister of National Defense, Madam Councillor of State, Secretary General of the Portuguese Intelligence System, Vice Admiral, Head of Military House of His Excellency the President of the Portuguese Republic, ambassadors, representatives of the Armed Forces and Ministry of National Defense, distinguished civilians, military and military authorities, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. It's my great pleasure to be with you today I think I need to move the speaker so it's better now. I am Colonel João Barro from the Portuguese Army and advisor to the Director of the National Defense Institute. And I would like to express my gratitude to be invited to be here to moderate this last panel of the day, compare strategic concepts, the case of Denmark, Spain, and Germany. We have the pleasure to have with us 3 speakers. And on behalf of the organizers, I would like to greet all of them and provide them a warm welcome to Ambassador Michael Zilmer-Jones, to Colonel José Luís Calvo-Alber with me, and Dr. Pia Furshop on VTC also, like the first one. I will try to keep in the premises of the time for the panel. I will introduce each speaker at a time, and they will have around 15-20 minutes for their communication. And after that, we will have a Q&A period. Okay. Having said that, I will ask Reggie to make available the video for the first speaker on Zoom, please. Go ahead. So we can all see Ambassador Zilmer-Jones. I will now introduce him. Ambassador Michael Zilmer-Jones is a Danish ambassador. He began his career in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working on the GATT, EEC accession, negotiation with Spain and Portugal, and well-development cooperation with Latin America, Angola, and Mozambique. He has served in several positions. I will not going to bother you with full details as you have his CV in your folder, but I will only mention some of the posts that he had as Secretary of the Embassy of the Danish European Union in Brussels, Counselor and the Head of Union Economic Session at the Danish Embassy in Bonn, and that's it. Having said that, I will now hand over the floor to Ambassador Zilmer-Jones, sir. Welcome again, and the floor is yours. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear, sir.
Fine. It is a great pleasure to be able to participate in this meeting with the Portuguese decision makers and colleagues. Through my long career in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I've always found that in spite of the geographical distance and also cultural difference, Denmark and Portugal almost always seem to be aligned in its worldview and in its view on issues both economic and politically. as is also the case with the Netherlands. And probably it's because we are all former empires with a glorious past that now realize that we are quite small countries. But still, with a global outlook, as great seafaring nations with interests and also responsibilities far beyond Europe. In Denmark, we have the tradition that our defense, both structure and budgets, are being decided by a very broad majority in Parliament. Normally, we do it in 5-year spending cycles or agreements. And the big advantage of this is that then the defense budget is ring-fenced, and we have for many, many years, we have been able to save the defense budget from other cuts in economic crisis. And also this means that even if we have changes of government, then the overall strategy and the plans for the defense will stay intact. And this time round, because of the need really to plan ahead, we are expecting a 10-year agreement. As you may know, we've just had elections in Denmark, and there are negotiations now between the governments to form a new government, and then we expect the political parties to embark on negotiations on such a new defense spending agreement, which will then begin by 2024 and run through 2033. And this also coincides with a decision made by a large majority in Parliament to move to the 2% target of defense spending as in relation to GDP in that time perspective. My role has been to chair a working group that has prepared this report. I see it's difficult to show it. We have unexpectedly a lot of sun today in Denmark, and this makes it a little bit difficult to see on the camera, I see. But anyway, we have just prepared this white paper, which is not a strategy. It's not a government policy paper. It is an analysis of the world as it is and as we expect it to evolve over the coming 15 years. So although it is the group that I chaired was composed of also the Chief of Staff of Danish Defense and representatives of ministries and also of the Faroe Island and Greenland government, then it does mainly reflect the inputs that we got from numerous Danish experts and research institutes, but we are of course also inspired from what other countries are doing. We looked at the integrated review and found a lot of inspiration in that, although I must say we are spending a little more time and focus more on the EU than the integrated review does. We fully agree with what Professor Rice said this morning, that we are at a really major turning point in global history, a Zeitenwende, as Chancellor Scholz called it, something which would be similar to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And of course, the most visible and dramatic expression of this new era is the ongoing war in Ukraine. But actually, probably the most important thing that we will witness is, as Professor Rice said, we are seeing the end of the unipolar world with the US as the one surviving superpower. We are going to witness a major shift in the balance of power from the West to the rest, and in particular from the US to China. And this means that also the liberal rule-based world order that we have known for so many years is going to be transformed, and probably into a much more fluid world order with many more strong actors striving for influence, competing. We are expecting this new world order to be much more brutal and difficult to navigate in for Europe and for European countries like Denmark. And what we also see is that the age of globalization is probably over, as we are moving away from ever more free trade, ever more sophisticated supply chain. Outsourcing is now being substituted by either home sourcing or friend sourcing. Everybody are looking at their strategic autonomy and how they can safeguard this. And we are going to see a very tough competition on technologies, as previous speakers have mentioned. And this has been one of the surprising things for us to look into, how big the impact will be of the militarization of technologies like quantum computing or artificial intelligence. And this might lead to some to think that we'll have a new Cold War. That's not what we are expecting, because in spite of the stronger competition with China in particular, there will also be a need to keep open trade and to keep cooperation going on issues like climate change. And I think we saw that being unfolded in the recent G20 meeting, and also actually, in spite of all the difficulties, in the COP27 meeting in Cairo right now. In Europe, in contrast, we are going to see a total decoupling of Russia from the rest of Europe, and almost a breakdown in economic ties, in human ties, and in interaction in almost any way, from just sort of the bare minimum of diplomacy. And this also has to do with the fact that although we would of course want Ukraine to prevail and prevail very soon, actually we fear that the most likely scenario for Ukraine will be another frozen conflict in Europe, which will stay with us for decades. And one very important impact of the rise of China is, of course, that this has changed the American threat perception. The US now, in their policy papers, say that they see China as the major threat, and as the only country with both the intent and the increasingly also the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to reshape the international order, and also therefore China as the most comprehensive and serious threat to US national security. And this, of course, means that that much talked about US pivot to Asia is really going to happen in the years to come, also in defense and security. And this will mean that the European countries will have to take upon themselves a much stronger part of the defense and deterrence against Russia. I mean, we don't expect the US to leave NATO or give up on Article 5 or the nuclear guarantee, but in many of the contributions that the US has made historically, the strategic enablers in space-based information gathering and communications, strategic airlift, the follow-on forces, and so on, that will have to be reduced. Not because the Americans don't like us anymore or because we don't spend enough. It is simply the logical an inevitable consequence of the challenge from China to the US. So this means that even if Russia had not attacked Ukraine, Europe and European countries would have had to spend much more on defense. And fortunately, we are seeing that all of the countries are now moving in that direction. Germany has made a major decision, and we are expecting that this will really transform the German military, which we really also need, because we will see in the future Germany being the centerpiece of the land-based deterrence of Russia in Eastern and Central Europe. And this is, of course, where we have the biggest imbalance with the Russian forces. Even though Russia have been weakened very much by the Ukraine war, we expect that once as soon as they are able to regroup, they will concentrate again very much on the northern flank here in our area, in the Baltic Sea, and in the Arctic also. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is, of course, the big difference that it will make to our security that Sweden and Finland has decided to join NATO. This will change the whole security geography in the Baltic Sea, which will be transformed into almost a NATO Mare Nostrum, with just the Russians controlling a small coastline outside St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. But of course, on land and as a continued threat to especially the Baltic states, Russia will continue to be, for us in our part of the world, the biggest and most dangerous threat. And this will mean also for Danish defense that we are going to move from the intervention force that the Danish military used to be, designed to go to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Libya, to Mali with major forces, to now focusing on territorial defense in the Baltic Sea, especially forward defense in the Baltic countries, but also in the Arctic region. And we expect to be able to renew and very much develop our cooperation with the other Nordic countries, but also very much with Germany in the future. We foresee a new division of labor between NATO and the EU. Unfortunately, Denmark has been able to join now fully the military cooperation in the EU by lifting the opt-out on defense cooperation. And this is very fortunate because the EU will have a strong role in all of the defense against hybrid warfare, the resilience agenda, and also in dealing with the threats from the global south. And that's, of course, one of the very difficult challenges for us in the future, is that while we see a resurgence of the threat from Russia, the threat from the global south, immigration, terrorism, is not going to subside. It's going to be reinforced by climate change. So therefore, the Danish military will have a lot of new tasks, but the old ones will go away. They will have to be dealt with in another way than the major military interventions that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. But we will have to retain a certain capability to engage with our partners militarily in protecting Europe's borders, but also in projecting European military power into Africa and probably perhaps also the Middle East in order to protect and safeguard our security. And the only way we see the Danish military can be able to do this with a manpower that cannot be expanded because of democracy and the labor market in Denmark is by investing heavily in high tech. We have to have a whole new way of equipping our soldiers, and we will focus a lot on technology in the future. And this also means that we will have to change the recruiting pattern and system, because now we don't need so many lorry drivers and people with experience in sort of basic machinery. We need high-tech experts, and they expect a totally different kind of salary and working conditions than the rank and file that we used to work with. I will stop here to leave time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your very welcome communication. Very comprehensive. And now I will introduce Colonel José Luis Calvo Albero. It's an infantry colonel in the Spanish Army. He is currently assigned as Director of the Coordination and Studies Department in General Secretariat of Defense Policy, Minister of Defense. Previously, he was assigned to the U.S. Army War College as an instructor of Theory of War and National Security, and he also had previous experience, military operations abroad in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Afghanistan. He is author of several publications, including The New Face of War and The Conflict of Chechnya. Colonel, sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Minister of Defense, Director, authorities. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thanks to the Instituto de Defesa Nacional for this invitation to talk about and to discuss about strategy and the production of strategic documents, something that is especially important now in these difficult times in Europe. And this is an opportunity to share our experiences. And listening to the previous speakers, I realized that in fact, we are facing very similar problems. It's logical because we are all European countries and we have the same, we feel the same threats and the same risk and the same scenarios. This is an opportunity to learn from each other, to learn from our experiences. So I'm going to talk about the Spanish case. And I'm going to speak about the National Defense Directive that was issued in 2020, 2.5 years ago. It's a short time, but in this time, a lot of things happened. In fact, I remember that this document was drafted at the previous, the starting point of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we could introduce some paragraphs, some sentences about the pandemic. But even if this was issued in February, March 2020, the document cannot reflect, for example, the problem in Eastern Europe, the invasion of Ukraine, and the consequences of the pandemic. So this is one of the problems of this type of document, that you write it and you issue it in a given moment, and then a few months later, or 1 year or 2 years later, you have very important events, international events that change the situation. So we are feeling now the necessity to draft a new one. But this is a politically linked document, so probably we will have to wait for a new government, because I will explain to you that this National Defense Directive is a document produced by every government when they arrive to office, for a term of 4 years. So usually, unless there is something exceptional happening, to draft a new one requires a new government. Okay. I don't know if I can for this. Okay, thank you very much. So this is my schedule. I'm going to speak firstly about the context and purpose of this document, the National Defense Directive. Then I will speak a little bit about the structure of the document, the different pieces, the contents. Finally, the key concepts in this document, and I will make some final remarks. So in Spain, there are different strategic documents. Until 2011, the National Defense Directive was the main strategic document. In fact, it was the highest level strategic document produced in Spain. But in 2011, the concept of national security was introduced in our strategic body, and the first national security strategy was issued. At that point, there was a discussion. Say, well, perhaps now the national security strategy is the highest level document, the one produced by the government and signed by the Prime Minister. So the National Defense Directive now, perhaps we have to downgrade it to the level of the Ministry of Defense, but the decision was to keep it at the government level, Prime Minister level, because national defense was considered as one of the key functions of the state. So now we have two documents at this level. We have the National Security Strategy, which is broader. National Security Strategy is about not only defense, defense is one of the parts, but it's also about internal security, environmental security, foreign affairs, cyber security, all the aspects of national security, which is much broader than just defense. But we have still the National Defense Directive, and still is a document signed, produced and signed by the government. Well, it's mainly drafted by the Ministry of Defense, but is approved by the whole government and is signed by the President, by the Prime Minister. And the document at the Ministry of Defense level is the Defense Planning Directive that is issued usually a few months after the National Defense Directive. So the National Defense Directive is the political document, and the Defense Planning Directive is more operational, more executive. Then both documents, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Directive, they are public documents. So there is no security classification, but the Defense Planning Directive usually is confidential. It's security classified. Not the latest one, because the latest one was issued during the time of the pandemic, and there was a decision by the government to make it public, just as a show of transparency in defense. But usually it's a classified document. So these are the three main documents regarding strategic concepts and strategic development in Spain. The National Defense Directive is something that is drafted, is produced usually when a new government takes office. So usually in the first year after taking office, this document is produced. It's drafted by the Ministry of Defense, but as I told you before, is approved by the government as a whole and signed by the Prime Minister. It's theoretically subordinated to the National Security Strategy, and it's logical because the National Security Strategy is broader and includes defense as one of the parts of national security, and then the National Defense Directive develops defense, okay? But I say theoretically because sometimes it's difficult to adjust the times and the order of the documents, you know? For example, now we have a National Security Strategy drafted in 2021 and a National Defense Directive drafted in 2020, which, well, both of them have been approved by the same government, so they are more or less coherent. But sometimes we have problems with this because the political cycles are sometimes complicated, and the production of these documents sometimes is influenced by these political cycles. As I told you, the document is approved and signed by the Prime Minister, and the document has three main purposes. The first one is to inform the citizens, the ordinary citizens, about what is going on regarding defense and what are the projects of the incoming government or the government in office regarding defense. So it has to be, due to this, has to be a very clear, understandable document. So it's not especially complicated. It's a short document. It's readable, easily readable. And this is the main purpose of this. So to inform the citizens about what is going on in defense and what are our plans, the plans of the government regarding defense for the next 4 years. Then it's a political document. Obviously, it's political guidance. And usually this document develops the political program of the ruling party ruling political party. All the political parties, they have a program when they go to elections. And in this program, there is a part, usually a small part, dedicated to defense. And in this National Defense Directive, once in office, the government develops his political program. Okay? And finally, it's a planning document, because this document is the starting point for a planning cycle. In Spain, we have a planning cycle of 2 years that is followed by another planning cycle of 2 years for review. So in total, it's 4 years, but it's divided in the production of plans and then a period of 2 years for the review of the plans. So and this is a difficulty, because you have to draft a document that at the same time is understandable by common citizens, but is the starting point for defense, planning, capability planning, military planning. So it has to be significant enough to be this starting point and to give clear guidance, but at the same time has to be general and has to be understandable and very clear. So sometimes there are some difficulties trying to make compatible these two aspects. The structure of our document, well, it's a very traditional structure. I think all the documents of this level are similar. It's not always the same, because it depends on the drafters, on the minister, on the prime minister, but more or less has always 4 points. The first point is just a presentation of the international situation, what is going on outside, and especially what is the influence of the events outside in Spanish interest and in Spanish security. There is a second point, and this is quite important and quite sensitive, and it's the definition of threats, risk, and challenges. So I say that this is difficult because it's difficult to have a political decision on that. We are not in the United States. The United States say, okay, I have 5 enemies, China, Russia, and then North Korea and Iran. Well, we don't do that. Our definition of threats and risk is very general. Okay, and it's a public document. Well, in the United States, it's also a public document, but they don't care. But in our case, we care. Okay, so there is not a definition of enemies, and apart from that, honestly, there is not a. In Spain, we don't have an enemy as such. We have problems of security, challenges, risks, threats, but we don't define you as my enemy. We don't do that. Okay, but in any case, it's difficult to have this decision. And above all, it's difficult to have the prioritization of threats, risks, and challenges, which is quite important for planning. When we start planning, the first question is, okay, what is your priority? Well, to say that in a public document is not easy sometimes. Well, there are opportunities to do that, because after the National Defense Directive, there are other classified documents, and in these documents, it's easier to have a decision. But in the National Defense Directive, sometimes it's difficult, because to say something and to put something in written is a commitment. If you, the Prime Minister, say that, well, my first priority is, I don't know, instability in Northern Africa. But then you have a conflict in Eastern Europe, a conflict like Ukraine, and you have put in written that your priority wasn't on the other side of Europe. Well, sometimes politicians are not comfortable with this. So sometimes it's difficult to have this definition, but well, it's something that you have to at least to try. The third point is probably the most important, is the definition of objectives, goals. This is essential for planning, and it's essential that in this case, the government defines what I intend to do regarding defense and security in the next 4 years. This is quite important in order to have a correct planning process afterwards. And finally, there is a fourth part of the document, which is guidance. And in the guidance, in the third point, you have the goals, the objectives, and in the guidance, you have the ways. How do you intend to do what you intend to do? Okay, so what are the instructions, the concepts, the actions, the project that you want to start to develop in order to achieve your goals? Okay, so this is the structure of the document. The document should be a short one. In fact, there was a discussion because not always been the case, because I remember some national defense directives of 25 pages. In this case, we tried to do a short document, no more than 10 pages. In fact, the document is, I think, 10, 11 pages. And even so, we were criticized by the Army, the Navy, and so on, saying, well, it's too long. This document has to be just 3-4 pages, just objectives and general guidance, and that's it. But well, it's always for citizens. It's also for citizens. So it's something that sometimes you have to develop a little bit. But in any case, we think that these documents must be short, very clear, very going to the point. And it's quite important to identify in these documents the key points, the key issues or the key projects that the government wants to develop during this term of 4 years. In the case of Spain, well, obviously each country has, and each government has different programs and different views about defense and national security. But in Spain, the 4 points included in this National Defense Directive were these 4. The first one, multilateralism in international relations. So there is a conviction in Spain that it's impossible for a country in isolation to deal with all the challenges and the risks and the threats of this globalized world of the 21st century. So we have to manage all this security environment together with other countries in the framework of international organizations, NATO and the European Union, through bilateral relations, in coalitions, but always together with other countries. And in this regard, for example, one of the ideas and one of the concepts of the government is that NATO and the European Union, both of them are important for security, and there is not a competition between NATO, or shouldn't be a competition between NATO and the European Union. NATO is already there and is the pillar of our collective defense. It's extremely important and has been clear now in the management of the crisis in Ukraine. But the European Union is also there with a lot of interesting security capabilities, diplomatic capabilities, economic capabilities. And regarding defense, is something to be built, and it's a promising project in the future. But it's complementary to NATO. Even if one day we develop our European defense capabilities completely, doesn't mean that we are going to compete with NATO. And in fact, we are the same, more or less, NATO and the European Union. So it's normal that we collaborate, and there is no competition, but collaboration and complementarity. Well, this was one of the key concepts included in the document. The second one was as has been mentioned also here before, and is what is called the comprehensive approach or whole of government approach to security problems. So the integration of all the available instruments in the management of internal crisis. That means that all the instruments working on security and defense must work together, not only the armed forces, but also the security forces, civil protection, the health system, infrastructures. So this is within the concept of national security. We are developing a national security structure where all the tools related to security and defense can work together. So the military, the defense assets, we can integrate into this system and work together with the police, with civil protection, with health system, and so on. Okay, so the key word is integration. Integration at international level in the framework of the European Union, NATO, United Nations, and integration at national level within a national security system. Integration is the key word in this document. The third point was a model of military intervention abroad based on a combination of soft power and hard power. You have to show strength, but at the same time, you have to show that you are always willing for dialogue, for negotiation, and especially respect for other cultures. This is a point that the government and the minister repeats a lot. When we deploy our forces abroad, we are always respectful towards other cultures. We try to not to offend the local populations. We try to collaborate with them. So this is a quite important point. And finally, the fourth point was related to all the social aspects of defense. So this government, when they came to office, in their political program, there was a project of improvement of living conditions, especially of the lowest ranks in the army, soldiers, corporals, improving facilities, lodgements, barracks, and some salaries, and some issues like, for example, to improve gender equality within the armed forces. So these were the four key concepts included in this document. And finally, some final remarks as a conclusion. Well, we need to take into account that the National Defense Directive is a political document. So it's the expression of the intent of a government regarding in defense for a term of 4 years. In this regard, this is not a long-term document. Okay, so we have other documents produced by the National Security Department or produced by other institutions analyzing the situation at long term. And even our planning, our capability planning, obviously is organized in short, medium, and long term. But the National Defense Directive is a document valid for 4 years, no more, for 5 years. So it's a political document of a government that is going to keep office for at least 4 years. This is the nature of the document. The document must be short, clear, and explicit, must combine this possibility of explain to the citizens in a clear language the situation of defense, but at the same time is the starting point for military planning, for capability planning, for the organization of the armed forces, for the planning process. And it has to be built around a few concepts, 3, 4, 5 key concepts, because this is the main aim of the document, to provide this input for planning, to say, well, these are the 4 or 5 key points that the government intends to develop, that the government considers as important, essential for the defense. So this is what we have to develop in the next 4 years. So that concludes my briefing, and I will be very, very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Please take your seat. And now we go for our third guest speaker, Dr. Pia Fropp from Germany, that serves as a research associate at the International Security Division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, where she focuses on German defense policy, arms procurement, and armament cooperation. She is also currently seconded to the Foreign Ministry as a scientific advisor to the drafting team of the Germany's national security strategy. Prior to the current position, Pia directed the Berlin office of the Institute for Peace and Security Research and also was advisor to the Green Party in the German Parliament, advising work on foreign relations and the Defense Committee. Dr. Pia Fropp, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Hello from Berlin. I hope you can hear me all right. We're facing the first winter snow and storm, so my internet connection, at least this morning, was not as good, but I see you're all nodding, so you're hearing me well. Thank you for the kind introduction, for the invitation of the NDI. Before I start my remarks, I really want to make two previous caveats or comments. I speak to you today as a think tanker and not as a member of the German government, so I don't speak for the government. And although I had the privilege of being a scientific advisor to earlier sort of early stages of drafting the national security strategy, that document is currently being sort of in the final stages of being drafted within the government. It's supposed to be published by the beginning of next year, and I am not privy to the information, but also not able to give you sort of a sneak preview of what is going to come. But still, I want to make 4 points concerning sort of the context, what I see is the context of Germany's strategic revision. What I think, secondly, is a very complex strategic landscape that we will face in Germany in the next 2 to 3 years. And I want to spend some time on saying something about the process of how we developed information in the context of drafting the national security strategy, and maybe end with what I see are 3 challenges ahead when the national security strategy is published. So let me start first on context. That's my personal view. Ambassador Zilmer-Jones already said, the Chancellor, I think, aptly termed the phrase Zeitenwende. And to me, Zeitenwende is always a coming of age process. Germany is coming of age in terms of security policy, and anyone who has children or remembers his or her own teenage years remembers that coming of age means that you question some of the fundamental hypotheses of a place you call home, and that, you know, questioning these hypotheses also comes with some growing pain. So what are the main hypotheses under review, I think, in the broader German security policy landscape as I see it? The first, it has been said many times, you know, I don't think that anyone doubts the American commitment to Article 5, and I think the current administration is very helpful in reinforcing transatlantic relations, but I think still the Trump years have left a deep mark on German security policy, and I think a deeper understanding that Europe has to be able to care for its own security, also in military terms, and this is something where Germany will take center stage. So that hypothesis, the US is going to come and save us, I think that has gone. The second hypothesis is also no surprise that for a long time, I think it was widely shared in the German security policy community that European security meant security with Russia. And I think we're having quite a firm consensus that security for Europe for the foreseeable time will not be security with Russia, but safety from Russia. And that's a quite tectonic shift. And the third hypothesis, I think, which probably more was an implicit one and is under review now, is that whatever is good for a deeply internationally integrated German economy is also good for German security. I think our dependence on Russian gas has driven home the lesson that these, you know, economic interdependencies are good for German security only under very specific circumstances, if they are asymmetric, if they're held with countries that are willing to use them as a geopolitical tool, then this creates vulnerabilities for Germany that have to be reduced as fast as possible. Why is that? Why do these insights come with growing pain? Well, I think it's important to remember that this traffic light government that came into power in late 2021 started on a very strong domestic transformation agenda and finds itself now, I think, increasingly bound by managing the fallout of the war. And I think the second growing pain is that redirecting German security policy comes with immense real domestic and financial costs. Whether it's the 100 billion for the special funds of the military or the increasing prices of energy, it's not, as a politician, you're no longer able to keep foreign policy, you know, away from the voter somewhere beyond the water's edge. That's my first point. My second point is sort of what is the strategic landscape that is evolving in Germany these days. As we compare different European strategic documents today, I think it's important to sort of situate where these different documents sit in a multinational and a national context. Multinationally, I think it really is important to underline how important the European Strategic Compass and NATO's strategic concept is for German security policy, which is sort of multilateral in its DNA. And I think most of the German government could only underline what previous speakers have just said about complementarity. But I really think sort of it's a big goalpost. Nationally, I think, the picture gets a bit more complex. I have looked into the coalition agreement yesterday and counted 64 strategies. It names 64 strategies, 10 to 15 of which have a heavy leaning on security and foreign policy, depending, how narrowly or how widely you define security. So all of these papers are going to come out soon. And I think that's going to make for an interesting picture. The national security strategy is a first in German history. It replaces the first part of what used to be the White Book for the Bundeswehr. It's supposed to be an umbrella document. It's giving general policy guidelines. It will identify main interests, priorities, and spell out, what's a value-based foreign policy, what this coalition always has campaigned on. So in one sense, it's going to replace something that we already know. I think it will also go way beyond it. The foreign minister, when she started the process of drafting the national security, said that she thinks of it in terms of, classic matters of defense, but also securing our freedom, the protection of our democracy, and last but not least, climate security. So we're going to see a very broad document. So subsequent, to this umbrella document that's going to come out, you have this absolute plethora of not so minor, I think, strategies that are, falling in place. I will just name a few so you get a sense of what it is that you can read over the next month and years. There's going to be a new China strategy, guiding principles on feminist foreign policy, climate foreign policy, and elaboration of the government's existing cyber strategy. The government pledged to have a new strategy on supply chains, on securing national resources, one on tackling disinformation. There's going to be one on, technological sovereignty and research, including military R&E. So that's just to name a few of, these many documents that are going to come out, and I think are going to make for a very complex picture of where Germany stands in strategic terms. My third point is I wanted to spend a bit of time saying something about the process of drafting a national security strategy. I think as a researcher, it's very interesting to follow a bureaucracy doing something for the first time. And not only because I was part of it, I think they really did a very good job, and I thought it was a very interesting process. The foreign minister, like the government as a whole, made a big point to say, look, this has to be inclusive. This should not, be an elite deliberation behind closed doors. So we really took sort of a 360-degree approach in many ways. It was a very intense period of consultations on a wide variety of topics, from climate change to cyber, geoeconomic dynamics, arms control, big trends in tech, the future of crisis management. So all of these were discussed in workshops organized by the Foreign Ministry, some by the Defense Ministry, some by the Development Ministry, with really a very diverse set of stakeholders. So we had think tankers, academics, different ministries, but also officials from federal states, from cities, parliamentarians, businesses, NGOs. And I think that really made for a very rich picture of where Germany is at and what people feel is their problem, and what should be a solution. And last but not least, I really wanted to mention that here, because that was also, I think, an experiment, and I think a very successful experiment, is that the Foreign Ministry did a very structured and intense exchange with citizens. They had 7 town halls all over Germany. The minister took off a week of her busy schedule to meet citizens and to discuss what should be in the national security strategy, what should be main priorities, where are dilemmas. So I think over 350 citizens participated. Some came to scenario workshops within the ministry. And the reason why I'm stressing it that much is because I think it was important to serve the political communication function of this document. It is one that's going to be public, and I think it is important for the government to explain what priorities are and how that will affect the everyday life of citizens. And I think it was also good, for bureaucrats to understand, how much good common sense the average German citizen actually has. So I think it was a very fruitful two-way street. So let me end by saying what I think are sort of tasks ahead once we have managed, or colleagues in the ministries have managed to produce this first time national security strategies. I wanted to name three. The first, I think, is good strategy making needs to be more than a one-time effort. I think we're placing a lot of burden on citizens as the world is changing fast. So keeping, the public engaged and ensuring public support for what a government has defined as its national interest, has defined as its priorities, I think is a key task. Much more maybe than it was so before. The second challenge is, I think, to produce more than a lot of papers, as I have said. I think 10 to 15 at the very least. And I think ensuring a coherent message across all of these papers will be quite a challenge for the government, because constituencies will read different papers, but do they all add up to something where at the end of the day, you can still say, ooh, this is where Germany is going. This is where the main priorities are. I think that's going to be quite a task to do. And last but not least, I think we're also up for some discussion on what the national security strategy will actually mean for defense and defense planning. We're spending, if I understand correctly, the 100 billion based on the conception of the Bundeswehr that was published in 2018. I personally think that's fine, because it's a document that already made clear, what are necessary steps that Germany has to take to be sort of the conventional land force for Central and Eastern Europe, as has been said before. So I think there may be no need for a really big reshufflement. Last week, there was a leak that the Chief of Defense had already, internally published its own strategy paper, I think called the Operative Guidance for the Bundeswehr. I don't want to comment on something that has not been, officially published by the government, but I think it obviously shows that there is still some room to figure out, how does it actually translate into defense planning. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, although we are already behind the schedule, we cannot finish without Q&A. It's a tradition in National Defense Institute. So may I ask participants to raise your hand if you want to put a question? Let me do a survey. Not so. May I ask the micro here in the front row for Professor Isabel Nunes? Thank you. Dr. Catarina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these three presentations. Let's try to catch up sometime, so I'll try to be brief. And I have basically the same question for the three speakers, which is trying to lead process with output. And in the Spanish document on national defense directive, it's my perception that there is a specific order of priorities regarding international missions. So you start from a strong commitment in the EU framework, then NATO, then the UN. So this is what I can in a broad reading take from the document. Regarding Denmark, we all know that Denmark is going to revise or is about to revise the reserves that it has related with the defense dimension of common security and defense policy. So this is also something which is novel. And for Germany, I think there is indeed a paradigm shift as well from leading from behind from the 90s and early 2000s to leading in the front. How the three speakers envisage, if this is true, what I'm saying, it may not be true, but if it's true, how do you envisage that this will be translated into the review documents? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So I will hand over the floor probably in the same sequence of the initial speech. Ambassador Zilma Johns, please.
Yes, I expect the background document that I chaired to be now the basis, as I said, for a new defense spending agreement. It will cover a 10-year period. It will define for each year the budget of defense, but also all of the major investments to be made, the structure of defense, the transformation, hopefully into a high-tech defense. So it will be a quite detailed and comprehensive translation into very precise guidance and decisions. And as you mentioned, of course, the fact that we can now participate fully in the EU side will open the possibility both to participate in EU missions and perhaps even more importantly, to participate in all of the development programs under the European Defence Fund, the PESCO cooperation, because as a small country, there are of course many capabilities that we could never acquire on our own, where we need to cooperate with others. But for us, like for all other nations, there are things to be overcome. There are some national reflexes in the military, in the defense industry, that are not just going to disappear overnight. Thank you.
Okay, Colonel Alvero, please.
Yes. Yes, regarding our participation in missions and
Please move forward. Thank you.
regarding our participation, the participation of Spain in missions and operations abroad, we have four different four different ways. The first one is the European Union. There is not a priority, but yes, we can say that NATO and European Union are the most important and the more frequent. So the first one is the European Union, and we have participated, I think, in all the missions and operations of the CSDP, and NATO. And NATO, we have participated almost in all the missions and operations. And in the cases we didn't participate or we stopped our participation, like in Kosovo, it was due to political reasons. So we always try to participate in all the missions and operations of the European Union and NATO. But we don't want to forget United Nations, and we always try to make an effort in peacekeeping operations in United Nations. For example, we are now in Lebanon, and we are making an effort in Lebanon, and now the force commander in Lebanon is a Spanish general, and we are participating too in Colombia in the peace process. So we try to maintain this way open. And then there is a fourth way, which is the collaboration bilateral or in the framework of a coalition, the coalition anti-ISIL, for example, in the Middle East, or a bilateral collaboration with many African countries, with Senegal, with Mauritania, in the what we can call the training of security forces and internal security. There is not an official priority, but yes, we try to give more importance to European Union and NATO. And there is not a priority between NATO and the European Union. So it depends on the scenario, depends on the mission and the operation. And yes, we try to reflect it in our documents, not only in the National Defense Directive, but also in the National Security Strategy. That there are also mentions to this. We always say, well, NATO is the pillar of our collective defense, and the European Union is the main security tool that we are member of.
And now, Dr. Pierre Fourot, please.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, I cannot say how it will feature in the document. I really can't. But I think in terms of, what's the German understanding of its own leadership role, I think that's been an ongoing discussion since 2014. It was always, framed as we have a leading responsibility, a bit more careful than say, oh, we're leading from the front and that's our ambition. In terms of the Bundeswehr, we also have the framework nation concept. It has always been clear that the Bundeswehr, because of its, size, should be a force where others can sort of lean on to in a way. I think maybe a good answer to your question is, as we're writing these strategies, we also already spend money. So we're already doing, material decisions are being made. And I think both the Chancellor and the Defense Minister have been quite clear that their ambition with the 100 million special fund is to make the Bundeswehr the conventional backbone for territorial defense in Europe. And that would mean more forces to that end, real ones, not only on paper. And that they would have to be ready and deployable. And I think if you want to interpret that as a more ambitious way of leadership, I don't think that's entirely wrong. So maybe a good way of thinking about Germany's role is looking at both what will be in these documents, but also what is already being, conceptualized and spent money on.
Okay, I think I have no questions, so it came to an end. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to congratulate the speakers for the very comprehensive presentations, very communications, and ask all participants to join me on a big round of applause for them. I'll now hand over the floor to the speaker, please.
The closing ceremony will now take place. We invite the Director of the National Defense Institute, Professor Isabel Ferreira Nunes, to address the audience.
Fear not, I bring one paper with me, but it's not to take you longer than needed. Madam Minister of Defense, Secretary of State for Defense, we would like to thank very much to all our guest speakers for their valuable insights on these current developments of the strategic guidance documents of these 5 countries, Denmark, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And for doing so in the context of our seminar, our national defense, our 4th national defense seminar, which is co-organized by the Ministry of Defense and the National Defense Institute. We will publish a conference report on the results of this seminar, as we usually do, and we hope to have this document quite shortly available to all of you. We thank you very much also for introducing us all the different contexts that shape your own national and international strategic environment, the substance of the strategic choices your countries are doing, the methods you have using to draft these documents, and also the stakeholders which you involved in the process. To all, we wish you the best of success in the conclusion of your own respective strategic reviews, because the success of these processes for each of our countries will make a difference, an enormous difference for peace and stability in Europe, and also, and above all, for the safeguard of the values and the principles we all commonly cherish most. And that's the most important thing. To the moderators, I would like to thank very much for your very committed way in the way you conducted the debate and the moderation. To the National Defense Institute teams and services, I would like to thank very much for your cooperation in the co-organization of this seminar. to Madam Defense Minister's Cabinet and to the Secretary General's team also extend our appreciation for your support, for allowing us to cooperate with you in the organization of such an important event as this one. And I wish to express also my appreciation to the support of all of you to this 2 days event. To our guest participants here at the auditorium and also those who are following us through video conference, I would like to thank you very much for your interest in this initiative, because your presence surely makes this defense community a much larger community, but also a much, much stronger community. Thank you very much.
We invite the Portuguese Secretary of State for National Defense, Professor Marco Capitão Ferreira, to deliver some closing remarks.
Your Excellency, the Minister of National Defense, the Director of the National Defense Institute, Madam Counselor of State, Vice Admiral, Head of the Military House of His Excellency, the President of the Portuguese Republic, ambassadors, representatives of the armed forces and of the Ministry of National Defense, speakers and moderators, other distinguished civilian and military authorities, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first underline the excellent work undertaken by the National Defense Institute. Under its core mission, IDN has accustomed us in making a critical and invaluable contribution to thinking about the security and defense of our country, and has been consistently instrumental in increasing dissemination and stimulating dialogue as a clear platform for debate. I therefore want to value the continuity of this work reflected here in the organization of this 4th National Defense Seminar that was today open to the public in pursuit of one of the priority axes of the work of national defense, to foster an even closer approach to society. These are great opportunities to think about major national and international issues with an impact on security and defense. At the same time, they allow for the dissemination of the mission that our armed forces carry out on a daily basis and to instill a greater national awareness over security and defense matters. I would like to make mine the appreciation that was just referred to the teams, the speakers, the moderators, and everyone that was a part of the work these days. I personally believe that the objective of thinking critically about the best way for the country to respond to its challenges has been fully met. I would also like to thank everyone who, on the teams, made this possible. We had the pleasure of bringing together at IDN national and international researchers, leaders, and decision makers in the field of security and defense. We gave particular emphasis to the comparative analysis of different strategic orientations of European countries in order to contribute to the ongoing national reflection regarding our own national defense strategic concept, a topic of the utmost relevance and which will require considerable attention over the next few months. Each country has its own traditions and realities, and we do not propose that Portugal should randomly adopt models that were developed for other contexts. Instead, the goal was and is to promote a comparative view of the different strategic orientations of European countries that have already been or are in the process of being updated, seeking to identify relevant lessons in the respective drafting and approval procedures. The new National Defense Strategic Concept that Portugal will adopt in 2023 will inevitably contain elements of continuity, but its revision process also stands at a moment of reassessment of our country's external and security agendas. At the same time, it signals priorities and concerns, triggering the necessary steps for the corresponding allocation of means and resources as a way of achieving the objectives that we chose to set. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in unprecedented times. The current moment is extremely challenging and demanding. The world is still reeling from a dramatic global pandemic with vast human, social, and economic effects and we continue to adapt to the impacts of climate change, seeking to build more resilient and sustainable societies and to develop more human and effective responses to catastrophes. As a consequence of the war in Ukraine, we are also witnessing important global geopolitical shifts with a significant toll on the transatlantic community. Meanwhile, we are also deep diving into the vast ocean of technological development with exponential discoveries in fields only matched by their disruptive potential. We need to figure out what to do with this. In an era of major geopolitical transformation and in a world that is increasingly connected and interdependent, but also more disputed and conflicted, there is a pressing need for us to adopt a more proactive attitude to deal with uncertainty. The way we respond to challenges today will determine our ability to continue to shape our destinies and safeguard our interests and values. Naturally, the instrument of defense is only part of the answer, but it is not a minor part. In this era, we must be prepared to deepen a reflection on the armed forces of the future, their missions, their organization, and their competences, so that they have the necessary flexibility to respond to these new needs and the ones that will be arising. By nature, the defense area contributes decisively to the resilience of our institutions and our society. When everything else fails, national defense ensures the continuity of state and its community. The reasons why society structures may fail vary considerably. This means that the mission of ensuring the well-functioning of the state cannot rest alone on the shoulders of the defense structures. Our work is faced outwards to prevent, to mitigate, and to respond to external threats. Today's world, however, has made the distinctions between internal and external threats less clear. Critical threats may emerge not only in the form of a military attack in the traditional sense, but also through the use of civilian means to cause havoc and disrupt services with potentially devastating human, economic, societal, political, and environmental impacts. This requires a whole-of-government approach. In fact, it requires a whole-of-society approach to security, establishing clear priorities and mobilizing the necessary resources to sustain them, be that military or civilian, public or private, national or international. In that sense, we need to develop further skills on technologies and learn how to take advantage of the best that our industry, government, and academia have to offer. Cooperative approaches and interoperability will be the key to achieve success. This investment in military capabilities and in their modernization will serve our national defense well, but it will also allow to leverage the development of a true European defense technological and industrial base. Therefore, in 2023, in line with the new National Defense Strategic Concept, the development strategy for the Portuguese defense technological and industrial base will be reviewed. Indeed, it is crucial that we engage more thoroughly with the defense industry sector and seek out common political and strategic priorities, as well as increase our efforts aimed at internationalizing the defense economy sector. Bearing in mind the lightning speed of technological evolution that has taken place over the last decade, we will make sure to align this strategy with the dispositions already found in the EU Strategic Compass and NATO Strategic Concept. This way, we will seek to reduce external dependencies in areas of strategic interest and contribute to the modernization of our armed forces while fully supporting them in their missions. I conclude by restating that the objectives defined for this seminar were entirely met. We shared ideas and debated different positions. We hope that with this forum, we can continue to do so and contribute to deepen our strategic thinking. I am personally humbled by the quality of the work done here in the past 2 days, and there's a lot to take home and consider and settle our mind around. Thank you very much.
We thank you all for your presence and collaboration. On behalf of Her Excellency, the Portuguese Minister of Defense, We declare the fourth National Defense Seminar closed.